Okay. So as far as I can tell, it's sending. There's a stream there, and I'll know for sure in about 30 seconds, but it looks good.
Okay, well, I want to finish sharing these links, so I'll have to wait till the stream comes up. So if we are live, and maybe there's a delay, but
Yeah. It looks like it's live from what I can tell in my live streaming thing. So, can you see
okay,
it?
so we're
Great.
back. Yeah, so sorry about that. We got disconnected, and a new stream.
Yeah,
So
so just bear with us. We're just going to reshare the stream there. I should have restarted my computer there. I've been quite busy this week, had a lot of personal obligations to tend to, so I've been a bit of a wreck.
okay, so also this week at the Royal Society, the physics of timekeeping, one of the mainstay issues of the Royal Society and physics over generations. Here was a nice video I found just on the history of cognitive dissonance, mostly with Festinger. I mean, look at that, like he embedded himself with like a doomsday cult of people who thought that they were going to be like picked up by aliens, and he theorized that when the prediction didn't come true, that people wouldn't just be like, "Oh, we were wrong," that they would double down and try to create some sort of explanation, as opposed to be like, "Oh, we believe in something ridiculous," and
Theorized
now we're going
that
to abandon our ridiculous belief. That Festinger proposed that that's not the method that the mind uses, and that the people would actually double down in their belief even in the face of overwhelming evidence. And so hopefully we'll go over the paper, and you'll see that 1956 he writes his I'm not sure if it was a book or a paper on when prophecy fails. And then 1957 he writes a book, a 300-page book on the theory of cognitive dissonance, which is a psychological model for a general theory, but first comes from research into uh, cults, and this hypothesis that people wouldn't admit they're wrong in the face of evidence, but would double down. So here's also the Royal Society proteins in 3D. Um, I have another one that actually that has um, Google Mind and the protein folding. But what do we know about protein and protein structure and three-dimensional? Important topic of research. I didn't have a chance to watch this. This was Consciousness: A Quantum Phenomenon by Christina de Morris Smith. I'm probably not going to be able to have a time to watch it. It was um, this last week. I'm not sure if this was in Europe or something like that, but good to see that there's lectures and people are talking about it. This was an interesting, um, also in Veritasium, called "The Man." I mean, they titled it in, God forbid, a scary way, "The Man Who Accidentally Killed the Most People in History," and referring to a specific scientist who came up with leaded gasoline. And there are a lot of problems with gasoline and the nature of gasoline. And in order to stabilize gasoline, one of the first solutions that was really used, I even remember leaded gasoline as a kid. Uh, that I think they still had leaded gasoline into the 80s, before they completely outlawed it. Uh, but it was a incredibly useful invention for the efficiency of cars and gas mileage, but God forbid, led to lead poisoning and pollution and possibly the deaths of countless people unnecessarily. And randomly afterwards, he was also the inventor of freon, that becomes one of the most serious greenhouse gases. And so this scientist, um, I forget the name. If he says Charles, was it Charles Kettinger, or maybe that's someone he worked with, went around the world measuring lead levels. So I guess lead is also a natural out product of smelting iron. And so through measuring ice levels or various places around the world, showed that lead levels in the air had drastically increased in the last few thousand years, most likely specifically to the Iron Age. So it was a pretty good chemistry video. I didn't have a chance to watch this. There was a debate, Sarah Walker and Lee Cronin, on aliens, 4 hours on Lex Friedman. And if
It was mostly not about aliens. It was actually quite interesting, most of what was discussed.
if people remember, she was one of the keynote speakers at the Science of Consciousness conference, specifically talking about the possibility of life on other planets, or and we mentioned that and in one of my post stream on Wednesday, the day after she spoke. Here, MIT Center for Brains and Minds in Machine is one of the scientists from Deep Mind, and he talked a little bit about chess, but most interestingly, he talked about protein folding. So, chess is just a game, or Go, in the history of computer science. The computer beating the world championship at chess, and then Go was very important in the history of computer science. But scientifically, uh, deep mind being used for protein folding is probably much more significant. So one of the people from Deep Mind was the guest at MIT. That was a pretty good lecture. Um, so I had mentioned, last week we were talking about, the Allen Center and financing and patronage, and I had mentioned, uh, Christopher Koch is now the head of the Allen Center for Brain Research, funded by Paul Allen, one of the founders of Microsoft, who donated $100 million. And Christopher Koch was one of the keynote speakers at the Science of Consciousness conference this year, and has a whole bunch of funding. And he's probably the big name in the neural correlates of consciousness. So this was 2013, obviously before he was appointed head of the Allen Institute, and he taught a course at Caltech on neuro consciousness, and so now he's one of the leading voices in the neural correlates of consciousness, and working at probably the single best funded brain research center in the world, the Allen Institute. Okay, so we'll do a chant. So I'm do a pretty popular one here. I got Aerosmith's Dream On. I assume you've heard this one.
Yep, definitely heard it a few times.
This is your Rolling Stone, the 172nd most famous song of all time. Now it's been cast down to 199, but one of the most popular songs ever written. It's off of Aerosmith's debut album, 1973. And if anyone ever seen Aerosmith in concert, it was usually like one of their encore performances, and it has a different, more classical sing-along song. I'm not sure if it'd properly be called a ballad. So I'm not. Are you familiar with the term ballad?
Yep. I don't know if I could distinguish it from a serenade, though.
Yes, I guess it has a specific structure, and even here, if it had like A B, so even here that it mentions the the Hebrew divine name of God, the ABCB version. Um, so it has a historical origin. Sometimes it's used like a ballad of rock bands, which is a more sing along, like an anthem type song that is very popular to sing and becomes one of the more popular songs of a band, even though it doesn't exactly fit in with the rest of their genre. So Aerosmith is kind of considered a hard rock band, and a lot of their music, I don't know if it's controversial, but it's lust music. I would say Aerosmith, 1973, uh, Sticks last week, the Renegade, the Oh Mama, I'm in song I sang last week was 1979. Um, so 1973, kind of in line with like the Rolling Stones, the post Beatles, uh, and I would say Aerosmith is kind of the master of the lust song, and most of their music is just kind of like God forbid, in praise of promiscuous women, and which I guess is that Steven Tyler probably becomes like the quintessential rock star, and the nature of a rock star, and the promiscuity that would go along with it. But this song has more general, somewhat religious connotations. It's pretty hard to sing. Steven Tyler has an extremely high voice, and also has like a crescendo, a build up. I guess Tyler has some kind of background in classical music. So I will attempt to,
Yeah, it has almost a vibe of falsetto.
yeah, and even the slow, even the the opening part is an extremely high key. Like like he has one of the he's not maybe even like Michael Jackson, just one of the higher voices in rock music, and so you could see it's in the, I'm not sure if it's in like G sharp major, so it's in not that common of a key signature, and it starts at an extremely high note. So last week I mentioned Renegade, the Renegade who had it made, the jig is up, uh so the high part moves up to about where Steven Tyler starts it, and then where he starts screaming "Dream On" is exceedingly high, and so that's why he's a famous performer, that he could hit those high notes. So we got Paul in the chat. So this, I'd say, if you talk like Freemasonry or the role of a rock star being some of the most famous people in the world in a karmatic balance, I'm looking at kind of like what Dream On. Really, they're probably singing about forbidden sexual relations. You like dream and your dream will come true, where you like eventually you'll get the girl. You wait in time, work hard enough, and you'll also be able to have relations with the promiscuous woman. Um, and I'm not sure if that's, I think that's the straight connotation of the song God Forbidden Line, but it has generic positive, um, even religious overtones, that it became, so like a ballad, a rock anthem that is looked to have a straight positive message, as opposed, there are other songs like Sweet Emotion, Love in an Elevator, um, Walk This Way, that are basically straight lust songs. So this is probably also a straight lust song, but the lyrics are more ambiguous and could be interpreted as kind of like a family friendly positive music, and just like keep at it and eventually you'll succeed,
Did you
even
ever
though it's,
see Get Shorty, the
I don't
movie?
think so.
Because there was a sequel, and I think he was in it, and he talked about Sweet Emotion actually being about his daughter. So I don't know if that was just for the movie or what, but for what it's worth.
Well, they probably have dual meaning. I'm not saying he's not like a one dimensional, um, character. And obviously, he's one of the most famous what people, Western personalities, and so he's not one dimensional. But I think Aerosmith in general, is like a master of the lust song.
I
So
guess I
here's
don't
this.
know the lyrics of it. To me, Dream On sounds sort of benign, but yeah, I don't know the lyrics.
Well, the lyrics are relatively benign, but what does it mean? Dream on until your dream comes true. And I think he talks about that also, like an interview where kind of like like, I mean, God forbid not to, I'm not making fun of him. I mean, Steven Tyler's but I mean, saying like you're kind of like a weird looking guy, but you're saying like like he'll get the girl. Like eventually he became the rock star, and now like he dates supermodels and the most beautiful women in the world, and so this is their first album, and but I think it does, in terms of his writing the song, it does have this connotation of kind of of like to get the girl, but the words are more ambiguous and could be interpreted in general any way of um, dreams coming true. So this is much higher than I would be capable of singing, so I'm not going to be able to sing in the proper key, and I'm not going to do the high part. It'd be beyond my ability to mimic Steven Tyler. Every time I look in the mirror, all these lines on my face getting clearer. The past is gone. It went by like dusk to dawn. Isn't that the way? Everybody's got their dues in life to pay. I know nobody knows where it comes and where it goes. I know it's everybody's sin. You got to lose to know how to win. So pretty generic, like even positivistic lyrics and even like karmatic processes that I would say like Aerosmith has that karmatic balance where he's mentioning like you can't sin and get away with it. You have to pay your dues in life. Um, it's interesting interpretable lyrics. Half my life in books, written pages, lived and learned from fools and from sages. You know it's true. All these things come back to you. Sing with me, sing for the years, sing for the laughter, sing for the tears. Sing with me just for today. Maybe tomorrow the good Lord take you away. Dream on, dream on, dream on, dream yourself a dream come true. So I can't even really attempt to hit his keys. Uh, Steven Tyler's basically unreplicable. He's got one of the most unique voices in music. Um, but in it's a hard song. Maybe some people could do a good parody. But I was just thinking there, 70s earlier feel for, we'll say, the lust song, and interesting, like the role of the rock star. So you're not going to have a one dimensional character where it's just basically um like I want to have forbidden sexual relations. So there's usually some sort of greater karmatic balance, and so Steven Tyler might be on the side where you could say he's not that, like, he's the master of the lust song, but he's not a one-dimensional character, and have to maintain a karmatic balance. And the Tanya, when it talks about a righteous person, there's the bare minimum where your good deeds are more than your bad deeds, and then like the truly righteous person who doesn't have bad deeds, or repents immediately and his heart's been purified. But for the general sake of righteousness, you have just a person whose good deeds is more than their bad deeds. And you can see like a lot of rock stars, famous people, celebrities um, keep their karmatic balance positive. that they do enough good things to at least temporarily allow them to, so to say, get away with their bad things. And I mentioned that a few times. They're called like double ledger accounting, and if like karmatically, if you have a calculation of your good deeds and your bad deeds, and to some extent they're separate calculations, but then there's also the sum total of a person's good versus their bad. And so, besides, it's really a great musical song. It's in it's very hard to sing. It's in a very high pitch and a unusual key like G sharp major, and but it's pretty brilliantly written. It has a lot of crescendos and build up and slow to the hero's journey is definitely seen in that song, starting slow and reflective, and you could almost look at it like an incantation to like magic. And I'm not sure if he was. I mean, he was in Boston, so I mean, not like Mr. Crowley or so Aleister Crowley, but he's probably connected in like Freemasonry and magic stuff like that. And you could look in the song as somewhat like a mantra incantation to make your dreams come true. So it's an interesting song. I thought I'd share that with this week in review. So with that, welcome to week in review. Hopefully, maybe Jennifer will read my paper, or I could read that. So that's all I got for this week. I have an acai bowl. So if Jennifer has what to share, I'll mute myself and let Jennifer do her week in review.
Hello, everyone. All right, so I've got my screen share here. I had peristalsis, which was not on the list. Oh, look at that. Well, I'm not going to reload this page, but suffice it to say that there was an interesting YouTube video for the science. I don't know. I think it is the Qualia Research Institute. And they had a three-way conversation. Very interesting. Going into, well, I don't want to say that the whole thing is doing drugs to test out the phenomenon of consciousness, but that is a fairly sort of considerable part of it. It's a bit of a balancing act because it does give the what might be described as paranormal psychological states. I don't mean supernatural by that. I mean simply out of the ordinary, but yet still conscious in the sense that, well, it seems like theoretically these states could be, if not quantified, then qualified to a sufficiently precise degree that there can be a reasonable determinants of shared meaning. So whether that was accomplished, I think they're partway there for sure, just because they're so passionate. It's kind of, it would be nice if the passion was more on the meditation side and less on the drugs side, but that's people's own decision, I guess, be safe and whatnot. So generally seem to cover this valence idea. What is the valence of a state of consciousness? So I've been thinking about whether that might be actually a useful term, because my only experience with valence is really chemistry. So I'm just thinking like electron clouds and that. But I suppose it could be some metaphor for states that are made of the same substance, e.g. electrons, but have different valence, e.g. numbers of electrons actively partaking in the bonding. Another thing that came up indirectly was the reference to a superfluid type entity when describing the sub substrate of consciousness, e.g., the aspects of consciousness that are more enduring than the purely fleeting experiential, but less enduring than something that you might refer to as a unifying principle of personality or some sort of information integrator and whatnot. And it was interesting to see the themes out of Buddhism come out there. Whenever I see a cross disciplinary analysis happening, it's nice demonstration of some degree of contemplation and understanding. I've been spending a lot of time this week on a video for a family member's yeah. So I haven't had a chance to do too much in the way of research. I've been making notes as usual, but it's not in a nice complete form and basically not ready to share. But I did find and spend quite a bit of time going over this Shankaracharya philosophy of Advaita, which was summarized on plato.stanford.edu for the first time last October. And I was not aware of it until I guess I Googled it. I Googled something close enough to the content of this that I was able to find it. And it's been really interesting to see how the translations have worked out and how the various words, like I have trouble understanding words like ontology, epistemology, even a word like metaphysics. Obviously, would want to shy away from something that doesn't have a really clear basis of understanding. But I sort of said, well, I guess I gotta make reference somehow to something super physical. So that's where I settled on metaphysics. But this actually talks about epistemology and ontology, and so it helps me put my own process in to English to whatever extent that's possible, or at least see how the Advaita process has been assimilated to whatever extent it's been assimilated across all the different translations that it's undergone and so forth. So I don't know if you're interested in this at all, but I'd be interested in reading both this and your blog. And I don't know to what extent, yeah, if there's anything that comes up interesting to go over, we can, or totally up to you.
Yeah, I read through that when you shared it with me. I mean, you want to read word for word the whole thing?
Shankaracharya, the Advaita philosophy?
Well, I mean, just this Stanford write-up. Is that what you wanted to do, or?
It would be pretty long to read the whole thing. I didn't have a plan. I will be reading it myself in its entirety on my own. As far as on the show, yeah, it might be interesting to go into a little bit of it, but probably not read the whole thing unless you are, unless it's a topic that you want to go into.
Yeah, it might be the matter for a separate stream or something. You could prepare educational material around. But yeah, it was pretty interesting, and it mentioned that the historical Shankaracharya. It's that a lot of people think, like, because there's writings, and a lot of the Vedas or the first Vedic commentaries popularized on a substantial amount come from Shankaracharya, and a lot of people consider Shankaracharya's school, and questioned the historical Shankaracharya versus, so to say, a school of thought, the Advaita thought that is kind of attributed to a founder person that may be more or less historical. And, so obviously ISKCON comes from an opposition school to Shankaracharya from, I believe, Madhavacharya was, the Sampradaya, and Shankaracharya is considered an impersonalist, uh, non-dualist impersonalist. And a lot of times when you listen to a lot of Hindu preachers, they do etymology also. Like what is the word, and they'll break word down, like guru or mantra, and you will break it down to its etymology and try to get deeper into the concept. And part of that is um, breaking a word down. Like etymology also is the history of the use of the word. And the Western canon, almost all the theological philosophical terms are Greek. And so if you have a Sanskrit canon, that Sanskrit also has a very rich uh, lexicon for philosophical terms. Uh, but usually that's how it's done. You break the term down into its meanings. And if it's like, Goswami, master of the senses, or the various words, and breaking it down to the root words to try to get a deeper understanding, and then the relational meaning. Um, but yeah, in academic circles or in the West, you would assume to be using the Greek lexicon, which dominates even in India. If they were translating the Sanskrit words, the most likely words that they would use to translate them into would be the Greek words, and it'd be the same. Like, what is metaphysics, or theology, or any of these words, and you break it down into its components, and maybe some sort of etymology, a history of the usage of the word, and then it'd be relational, like defining the word in relation to something else. And a lot of the concepts are quite complicated, and if a person's never thought deeply about it, uh, they may, no matter how you define it, like metaphysics, ontology, hermeneutics, or something like that. You could define the word, you could break it down to the components, you could talk about the origin, but if a person hasn't put much thought into it, they're going to have to hear these words many, many times. But if you're into we can review science, epistemology, metaphysics, all of these things, they're important. And so I started writing, and I did a lot of research, but quoting things accurately, using precise language is important for communication, and probably something worthy of its own to work on.
We should take, the show in that direction, almost like what we did with science of expertise. Because did we really answer that? I think we made it clear that not every domain of expertise would even necessarily have experts in the same way or evaluate experts in the same way. But yeah, just hearing what you're saying right now really seems like you understood. That's really good. The way I always look at it is I assume the person already understands something metaphysical, quote unquote, like big tent metaphysical, and then it's just a matter of finding what it is and then mapping onto their existing whatever that basis is. And that's sort of neither here nor there, but I thought you'd be interested, and I think you did sort of mention that right at the beginning about the Maya Vaden. Did you note that allegation there about being a Maya Vaden was made of Shankaracharya?
Yeah, I'm saying ISKCON Shankaracharya is a common, like punching bag of like Mayavadi, and from their perspective is a propagator of inferior teachings. So that so if you're go to ISKCON or listen to lectures or read Prabhupada literature, you'll hear Shankaracharya mentioned almost always in a negative way, and he's your quintessential Mayavadi, at least according to some might defend him from the claim, but within the sectarianism that he's still respected maybe as like a saintly person, but someone as representative of what happens when you have the wrong theology. And but the Shankaracharya theology is more popular than probably ISKCON's. Shankaracharya is probably the most mainstream of Hindu scholars in in all of Hinduism. But saying that of the Orthodox schools, of the personal schools, especially the deity worship uh, schools, Shankaracharya is the favorite person to critique because he's the person people have heard of, and they're gonna be like, oh, but Shankaracharya said, and like, well, Shankaracharya was wrong.
Was he?
Well, I'm saying,
Non-dualism.
according, I just mentioned that if you go to ISKCON, that Shankaracharya, is the quintessential Mayavadi, and the warning of incorrect theology. So if you have a multiple truth hypothesis or something like that, but I mean it's sectarian, and that he says certain things that are opposite of um, ISKCON principles in many ways.
Does ISKCON call itself dualist?
No, I mean the Lord Chaitanya has his like Achintya Veda Veda, where it's um, you're same and different at the same time, which is some sort of attempt to resolve the paradox by saying that it's really uh, both you know spiritual and physical, different and non-different at the same time.
Yeah, I guess if you only have non-dualism, it is pretty restrictive. If you, yeah, I mean, where do you start? So,
I mean, so I'm a dualist, but I mean the dangers of non-dualism, of like, well, everything is God, therefore uh, it could lead to sinful, like from a Hasidic point of view, it's like, well, God's in the bathroom too, or like if everything's God, what's the difference if you sin, or what's the difference between good and bad? God is in evilness also. That like Charles Moskowitz might refer to as Sabbatean. So in that sense, from like ISKCON point of view, Shankaracharya is kind of looked at as Sabbatean, and they might strawman his arguments in terms that they like make him say things that he's not really saying, but look like, oh, Shankaracharya, like I'm God, you're God, everything is God. It doesn't matter what you do. And so the push back and say like that's bad. It does matter, and you can't just sin and get away with it. And based on this Mayavadi philosophy. And I was talking to Jennifer about the importance of accurately quoting people and representing what they said accurately. And you go into my paper, I go through a lot of different schools, and I was thinking like Charles Moskowitz is like the master sophist, where everything he says is like a slight push of sophistry from what the person actually said. And that's normal, like because he's trying to be uh trendsetter, he's trying to be an opinion maker, and push people to think in a certain direction. So instead of accurately saying over what the other person said, he'll give like a slight straw man to everything in order to push it one way in his direction, largely an attempt to win you over to his way of thinking. And really that's sophistry, and it's negative from an intellectual point of view, but it's common. Most people in media do it. Clearly, like media, and like like Trump supporter, Democrat leaning. Uh, it's commonplace. So from that point, like straw manning Shankaracharya that like, oh, Shankaracharya was like a hippie who said like you could sin and get away with it because God, because I'm God, you're God, non-dualistic, everything's God. So therefore, it doesn't matter what you do, which isn't actually what he says. It's a straw man of what he does, but the purpose of the straw man is to convince people that the philosophy is bogus.
Yeah, wow, an absolutely fascinating straw man.
I mean, it's really sophistry in general.
Yeah, because I would argue, from a non-dualist perspective, even the most enlightened soul who took birth would be subject to the same illusion of Maya or ego or whatever as the least enlightened soul because of non-dualism. So I'm really glad I have this reference, and I guess we can start with yours if you want to. You want me to read? I don't know if I can read the whole thing because my mouth dries up, but I can start and go as long as I can.
Okay, I'm eating my side bowl, so go ahead and just mention this is on track. I did a whole bunch of research. I read his whole 300-page book. I read a few books. I read a bunch of papers. Um, but this is almost in line. That'd be like ready to be like a historic overview in a scientific paper. And Jennifer was mentioning like I just on review I don't have a blog spot or something where I could be like Wikipedia and a embedded link to what I'm talking about. And as I do more research and write, like these things are at the tip of my finger. A lot of these ideas are overlapping, and to be an expert in something, it was like, what's the study, what's the year, a certain chronology, and so I feel good about the writing. I'm gonna keep on doing it. This one's pretty dense, as I tried to pack a whole bunch of information. So yeah, go ahead and I'll mute and keep on eating. If you run out of steam,
If I give
I'll take.
feedback about the style as I go based on hearing it, is that too much, or are you interested in that kind of feedback?
You could pause and give your feedback as you read.
Awesome. All right. So cognitive dissonance. And just for the audience, if you don't know already, this is a topic extremely close to my heart. And I was very happy to see that what I've got has already been said by others and collected in this relatively short piece. So very appreciated. Very much appreciated, at least by me. And it looks like I got 32 views. So congrats. And I'm sure after this show, tons more people will go check it out. All right. So cognitive dissonance is one of the best known psychological theorems with explanatory power into the basic motivations of human behavior. Unlike the majority of early psychological theories, cognitive dissonance, or CD, has survived the advancements in neuroscience and advent of the hard problem of consciousness, with modern neurological studies verifying CD and being incorporated into many of the top theories of mind. My own MTH relies on CD as one of the central precursor theories. In this essay, I will explain the fundamentals of cognitive dissonance, trace the origins of CD within the greater framework of psychology at the present day, including the neural correlates of CD, and go over a few recent theories of mind that have incorporated CD. That was pretty good. I would say this should have a space to be a new paragraph. Because if I
You're
think,
reading from the chess server,
yeah,
and yeah,
is it
for whatever
impossible?
reason,
Is it like Reddit spacing? Not that I know what that is, but is it
yeah, for
possible?
whatever reason, when I copied and pasted, it didn't keep the tab for the new paragraphs in the chess server. So
Yeah,
you're right. It should.
I assumed you did that unintentionally. So you agree that this is just like a stylistic thing. A paragraph should be approximately a certain length. It's almost an aesthetic thing, like maybe a chunking of ideas within a single writing.
Yeah, and usually there's like a tab. It starts a little further into the page, but for whatever reason, when I put it on the blog spot, I didn't make sure that it had it. I copied and pasted, and it didn't paste the tab. So I have to be more careful next time I post it about that. I like
Another
to,
thing, go ahead.
the basic format and give a good telegraphing or flow chart of what I'm going to do. It's the opening paragraph just to clearly explain how I plan on structuring the essay and what I plan the objectives of it are.
Great. Cognitive dissonance originated with Leon Festinger. Festinger studied religious movements and false prophets, going as far as to embed himself with an occult personality witness people when their predictions failed, and published his findings in When Prophets Fail. Festinger posited, based on historical analysis of similar groups dealing with the fallout of failed prophecy, that despite the evidence, people would not admit they were duped, instead doubling down on their apparently obviously wrong beliefs. Following year, Festinger published A Theory of Cognitive Dissonance in 1957, the comprehensive psychological model explaining the phenomenon, which could be applied to general human behavior, belief, and motivation. Cognitive dissonance is a form of stress caused when there is a mismatch between a person's action and cognitive phenomena such as feelings, ideas, beliefs, values, and environmental perception. Festinger borrowed the term from music, dissonance referring to a disharmony of sounds, to emphasize that dissonance between mind and action is normal, as opposed to stronger language like hypocrisy. Dissonance simply refers to inconsistencies, and consonance, like in music, the resolution to the dissonance, returning to a state of consistency. Cognitive dissonance lends to more scientific interpretation with a mathematical interpretation, where CD can have a magnitude and be seen as a ratio between the sum of dissonant cognitions divided by the sum of dissonant and consonant cognitions, or sometimes just the ratio of dissonant to consonant elements. Magnitude showing the amount of dissonance of the various cognitions to actions, representing the inconsistencies we face, signifying a measure of how much stress a particular dissonance causes a person. To reduce the stress, cognitive dissonance reduction, the person must choose between a few options. One can attempt to change behavior or change the cognition. Both difficult tasks. More common is for people to justify the action or cognition by changing or adding new behaviors or cognition that at least temporarily reduce the dissonance. Or one can fully ignore and reject information that conflicts with previous held beliefs. As mentioned, Festinger developed the theory studying religious cults and failed prophecy, but quickly adapted cognitive dissonance to general cognitive phenomenon, designing many ingenious experiments to demonstrate the phenomenon, usually in a counterintuitive way, showing that people will justify illogical behavior to reduce dissonance. That was a good place to end that paragraph because it opens the door to maybe, I don't want to say meta logic, but reasoning about a reasoning process that lends itself to self deception, which is where this justify term, or perhaps the term excuse, comes in. Cognitive dissonance in the 1950s was a pivotal theory in changing the paradigm of how we understand psychology and human motivation, and has stood the test of times in repeated tests and studies, later further vindicated with neural correlates. In the 1950s, the dominant psychology theory was behaviorism, the theory that human and animal behavior can be explained in terms of conditioning without appeal to thoughts or feelings, and that psychological disorders are best treated by altering behavior patterns. Similar to Freud's psychoanalysis, cognitive dissonance focused on cognitive processes, including unconscious motivations. Cognitive dissonance can be considered part of the larger cognitive revolution of interdisciplinary studies of the mind and its processes that displace behaviorism. Festinger, together with other great thinkers like Noam Chomsky, Universal Grammar, Marvin Minsky, Alan Newell, and Herbert Simon, chunking theory, showed that cognitive processes affect behavior as much or more than conditioning. The 1960s saw many tests and advancements on CD, but in the 1970s and 80s, other alternative cognitive theories became more popular than CD, such as Elliot Aronson's expectations of self and Higgins' self discrepancy theory. Although similar to CD, more focused on self perception and dissonance from our self concept, our behavior, and the way we are viewed from others or perceive the environment. In 1983, Jerry Fodor proposed in Modularity of Mind, offering an evolutionary explanation for the CD phenomenon, hypothesizing that the mind is composed of innate neural structures of mental modules which have distinct, established, and evolutionary developed functions, hence push one in different directions, causing dissonance, which is moderated by higher order processing somewhere in the brain. Even though research started following different directions, many new theories built on cognitive dissonance started following different directions. Let's see here. My computer's frozen, so you might want to take over. It seems to be having a bit of trouble. Let me see. Okay, no, it's back. Many new theories built on cognitive dissonance theory and tests and experiments continued to confirm the CD phenomenon, and the expression cognitive dissonance entered popular culture as an explanation for irrational decisions people commonly make due to conflicting beliefs. In the last few decades, cognitive dissonance made a comeback with new studies focusing on the neural correlates, using various methods to measure what happens in the brain while repeating classic CD experiments. A series of experiments using fMRI scans confirmed a neural basis to CD, showing changes in the striatum region of the brain, reflecting people's change in beliefs when mismatched with various actions. All right, so I think I should take a break because my mouth is pretty dry. I'm like, let me see here. I think I'm halfway
Okay.
down the third to last paragraph. Yeah.
Okay. It's a neural basis of rationalizations, cognitive dissonance reduction during decision making showed that neural activities of rationalization occur in seconds without conscious deliberation on the part of the person, and the brain engages in emotional responses during decisions. 2010 study. And contributions from research on anger and cognitive dissonance to understanding the motivational functions of asymmetrical frontal brain activity of Eddie Harmon Jones, 2004, correlated anger and emotions with decision making and the dissonance reduction process. Further studies also showed neural correlates of CD in relations to guilt, envy, and embarrassment. Studies showed cognitive dissonance also functions in monkeys and young children. As tests continued to affirm CD and reveal the neural correlates, more advanced theories focusing on the exact neural mechanisms behind CD appeared. Just a brief essay that when I say cognitive dissonance survived the test of times, that psychology was purely based on psychometrics. And when you had the neurology revolution and the advancements in testing of the neural correlates like fMRI, EEG scans, and all these various things, that you need a biological mechanism for the theory to work. So, like Freudian psychoanalysis or other cognitive theories that couldn't successfully show neural mechanisms um, became invalidated, as opposed to cognitive dissonance. In 1957, neural mechanisms were discovered to vindicate the theory. So the theory, not only was proven in psychometric tests, but then they found actual neural mechanisms to show the theory. So the more recent theories don't focus on the cognitive aspect, they focus on the neural mechanisms. As seen in my previous essay on the Science of Consciousness conference, in the last few decades, as technology and neurosciences has advanced, so too have theories of mind, some specifying mechanisms behind cognitive dissonance. Eddie Harmon Jones, in an action based model of cognitive dissonance processes, 2015, proposed psychological dissonance occurs consequent to the stimulation of thoughts that interfere with goal driven behavior, extending the original CD theory by proposing a mechanism for how CD prompts dissonance and dissonance reduction. The action based model focused on cognitions with action implications, conflicting with one another, making it difficult to act, often picking short term decisions against pitting short term decisions against long term decisions. And so it's like I mentioned that cognitive dissonance theory, when it was created by Festinger, didn't have a mechanism. It just said that this is what happens and why it works, but it didn't actually have a mechanism for why it worked. So in 2018, Roop Askari Karinen proposed the theory of predictive dissonance relating to the CD phenomenon uh, to theories of predictive coding around since the 1860s with Helmholtz's unconscious interference, but regaining popularity in the materialistic models of mind focusing on the brain's function of making predictions about our environment and how the environment will respond to our choices. Predictive processing presents a new take on cognitive dissonance with an underlying account of perception, action, experience, and expectation, providing a theoretical, possibly empirical account of a fundamentally embodied and environmentally situated mind with the larger predictive processing model attempting to fully explain the CD phenomenon. Cognitive dissonance has returned to the forefront of psychological research and a central place in new theories of mind. Cognitive dissonance theory has a rich history, standing the test of time. Unlike many psychological theories, CD has been vindicated by advancements in technology and neurology. The basic concept of CD is well known to most educated people, part of the common lexicon, and coming up in everyday conversation related to peculiarities in human behavior and decision making. At the same time, new studies on the neural correlates of the CD phenomenon are helping to advance the understanding of the brain, and CD is an integral part of many of the leading models of mind, attempting to incorporate the CD phenomenon into an integrated model of mind. Any model of mind must explain the well documented CD phenomenon. My multiple truth model also incorporates CD, helping to explain cognitive processes and decision making in general. Future essays will go further into the nature of decision making and CD function at many decisions where there is a cost to choosing one thing over the other. In coming essays, I will return to chess studies and chunking theory, which also have close connection to cognitive dissonance and decision-making processes. And as I forward my multiple truth hypothesis, cognitive dissonance will emerge as one of its fundamental pillars. So this essay took a lot of work,
Yeah, it's
actually.
really good.
Um, I mean, the writing, once I got down to writing, but like I did a lot of research because I wanted to cover the full gamut of the history, and I actually read Festinger's whole like 300-page book, 1957. I read a few articles, and in like to get the history, and I'm starting to piece things together when I was thinking like the cognitive revolution. It is interesting if you think like Jewish science that behavioralism was the main understanding when Germany was at the center. And although there were some Jewish behaviorists like Wundt and Taylor and some of the big names in conditioning, and the idea was what we thought or felt doesn't matter. Like Pavlovian dogs that you could condition people. You had things like lobotomies and shock treatment that were popular at the time. And Freud comes up with psychoanalysis, which is a cognitive uh, understanding of mind that was controversial, and Freud wasn't as provable. So cognitive dissonance is one of the first cognitive theories that is demonstrated in lab experiments, and they have a few different ways of testing it, with like, giving $20 or $1 and then asking people whether they enjoy the activity. But there's a whole bunch of tests that they were able to devise and assuming the cognitive dissonance theory predict the outcome, and those have been repeated many times. And new tests, besides saying the phenomenon when he was talking about failed prophecy, isn't really something you could test in a laboratory. But it's interesting in the video I shared that they actually joined or pretended like they were trying to join this cult of people that thought they were going to be picked up by a UFO, and they were in the house with the cult when the UFO was supposed to appear and pick them up. And then when it didn't appear, they he recorded what they were saying and how they went over it. And his prediction before it happened and why he made sure to embed himself in the cult was that they wouldn't be like, "Oh, this is nonsense. We were wrong the whole time. You tricked us." That they would double down and come up with ulterior explanations to why their prophecy failed, and instead of just saying like this is ridiculous and dumb, like no UFOs coming to pick us up, that they say like, oh, like like something happened and the UFO is going to come next month. And but from there he created a basic cognitive model for how we go about decision making that connected emotion, and similar to multiple truth hypothesis where there would be a cost to different choices. And the cognitive dissonance is mathematical, and he has like a formula, and the formula is like a magnitude. And if you notice, there are two different ways to formulate it. You could have the dissonant cognitions divided by the sum total of dissonant and consonant cognitions, or you could look at it as just as the dissonant divided by the consonant. But either way, it would have some sort of ratio, and the ratio would have a magnitude where not their cognitive dissonance is a phenomenon, but not all cognitive dissonance are the same, and it could possibly be predictive, and that's why later theories of mind, like I was mentioning at the beginning, like Carl Friston and active interference and Bayesian modeling, fit very well with cognitive dissonance because the mind is naturally trying to make predictions, and there's
You're saying the
ambiguity.
mind is using something like prior odds in its computation of or estimation of the future.
Yeah, so in terms of social outcomes, things that are connected to emotion. So the predictive mind, just in terms of like sense perception, and trying not to stub my toe, or trying to predict uh, the perception of the environment, like driving versus interacting with people and decisions that have a cost. And so cognitive dissonance could apply to purely uh, sensory phenomenon that don't involve emotion, but specifically to things that have a cost. Like failed prophecy, where you're part of a group and you might have group membership or embarrassment. And I mentioned in the paper that cognitive dissonance falls out of favor in the 70s to theories that focus more on the self perception of self. And the key thing of dissonance is the dissonance between how we perceive ourselves and how others perceive us. Uh, but the point that there's a cost, that when I perceive myself in a certain way and then I act according to my self perception and I get negative feedback, that the distance, oh, these people really don't like me, or something like that too. So like, oh, no, really they do like me, or whatever the case is, where either the person has to recognize that their predictions are wrong and make new predictions, or they keep with the faulty predictions and reinterpret the information of why the prediction isn't working out as well as they thought it should. And so the predictive mind,
Spontaneous dissonance minimization.
yeah, so like from a Fristian active interference model, it would be the brain doing like instantaneous Bayesian analysis.
Um, and so you're mentioning the ratio there between A and B versus over A plus B.
Yeah, so there's two different ways of doing either A, A is dissonance and B is consonant. So it could either be A divided by A plus B or just A divided by B. But I mean, either way, you're going to have a magnitude. And, if it was like an active interference predictive mind model, you would have a threshold that, of dissonance. So in all scenarios, like, oh, I don't want, okay, I'm just dealing with Jennifer now or the chat. I don't want Jennifer to be upset at me, but I don't want to change my behavior patterns. So if there's a
Yeah,
dissonance,
that's true. We could all relate to that.
well, you're saying it's all human interaction. So there's um there's a friction to changing, and then there's also a cost to not changing, and so like in a Fristian active interference predictive mind model, it would be a Bayesian analysis instantaneously conducted by the brain, and you would go with like the higher number. So if the friction to change or the pain caused by the change would lead to decision making in the person, and then you have the other factors like, well, can I add in new beliefs? So if it's a model like A divided by A plus B, and it's at the threshold where I have to change behavior, but what if I add in a whole bunch of new beliefs, like like example like smoking or dieting, like, oh, just one more, or saying, like, oh, I'm probably going to die young anyways, or some sort of other cognitions that you could add to the equation to keep it from going over the threshold. And so if you're a person like, oh, I'm part of this cult, and the cult believes these crazy things that didn't come true, you have like I said, a lot of cults have the us versus the world mentality, where like, well, of course I'm right and the whole world is wrong, and or like our little group is right and the whole world is wrong, and within our own little cognitive, mind bubble of our mind, we could add in small bits of information to keep us from the dissonance of saying, well, maybe this cult I'm in is just dumb. Of course we're not right, and the whole rest of the world is wrong. And so you could keep on adding in small pieces of information or actions that keep you within the balance. And that could be instantaneous calculations, like, well, this is dumb, but if I admit that it's dumb, I'm going to lose the few friends that I have, or various thing, like, like, well, it's a stupid cult, but at least there's a few cute girls in the cult, and I have a decent chance of reproducing if I stay in the cult, and if I get out of the cult, then I'll have nothing. Or whatever type added cognition a person could add to rejecting the obvious, that like this is just ridiculous and not true.
Well, it's
It's like a cost
expectations
benefit
too.
analysis. And so that's why cognitive dissonance lends to a mathematization of a cost benefit analysis. And it's correlated to neural correlates that when they tested, it shows, the part of the brains that are believed to control these activities, with the neural correlates, and even more so with the Bayesian models of the mind, that it'd be possible that there's some sort of internal uh, neural Bayesian analysis that is actually taking place.
I missed the connection to the neural Bayesian analysis. Why is that incompatible?
That is compatible, saying that the cognitive dissonance theory is compatible with the predictive mind using Bayesian analysis to resolve dissonance.
Ah, okay.
That's
So
why cognitive dissonance has made a return as one of the more popular psychological theories in the last decade, because it's fitting in with the predictive mind and the brain, being a Bayesian analysis machine.
Yeah, that reminds me of people tending to learn things the hard way, and the cost benefit analysis being a minimum energy solution reiteration process that eventually, I guess, causes its own state transition through repeated, I don't know, some sort of repeated iterations. That is a pretty interesting model. I've had a hard time seeing the utility of the Bayesian framework, but this is actually not half bad as a model for
It's
what's
more
the best
popular
way
than
for
the
us to understand what it is that we're doing.
it's
'Cause
more
we're not just
mainstream and
observing
popular than
qualia.
Penrose
Sorry.
Hameroff,
Yeah.
saying that the Bayesian brain is the mainstream model that's taught and accepted in academic circles than something like Penrose Hameroff.
Well, couldn't the Penrose Hameroff substrate be the engine of the Bayesian simulation?
Well, it's like T Jump said, it's not necessary. So if there is a quantum mind and there's some quantum phenomenon happening in the microtubules, um, it's not necessary because they believe just the neuroelectric circuits of the brain without coming on to anything quantum is enough to explain consciousness. And it's not like evolution, like it's not that mainstream, but in terms of like a Kuhnian revolution, the dominant working theory now is probably the predictive brain uh, using Bayesian models. But it's not like evolution yet. But I would say that that's the dominant model right now. Is as I said, the predictive mind using Bayesian analysis, and it doesn't need anything with quantum or microtubules. The pure neuroelectric circuits are believed to be sufficient to explain consciousness, and it's the reverse anthropomorphization because they think that if the computer and electric circuits could do these things, then it's likely that the human mind with the neural circuits would be able to do this without needing any further quantum phenomenon to explain consciousness. And
I
that's
guess
actually what
when I see something
that's
like,
actually what T Jump said to you, if you
yeah,
remember when you debate T Jump, that your quantum mind was unnecessary.
yeah, I kind of baited him by saying that he can't disprove that the universe is conscious, which there's basically no way he wasn't going to fall for that. I take full responsibility. When it's just a quote from your thing, moderated by higher order processing somewhere in the brain. That seems to suggest it. The quantum thing.
I should have said, like, I forget the exact part. If I'd done more research, if it's the cerebellum or prefrontal cortex or something, that I mean, they believe they know the region where it's moderated, but they don't have. And there's some neural correlates to show that higher order thoughts, but it's this was going back to the modular mind, that you have these lower level modules of the mind that do specific functions, like language or various things that would visual processing, and then there would be a part of the brain of higher order thought that regulates the various modules, and so the modules would produce possibly conflicting data sets, and then it would go through some sort of central processor of higher order thought that would um, integrate and make a cohesive so to say, decision. Like there has to be a mechanism for cognitive dissonance. So I mean, cognitive dissonance theory was psychometrically successful, that it accurately made predictions psychometrically. But these days that's not enough. You need to have a neural mechanism also. So in that sense, that cognitive dissonance matches with most neural understandings of the brain. Like if it was Stephen Grossberg's The Resonant Mind, or Fodor's the modular mind, that there's different areas of the brain that process different sorts of data, and they might draw different conclusions, and then there would be a section of the brain that essentially does a Bayesian analysis and takes this all the various information relevant to the decision from the various modules of the brain, and through the Bayesian analysis will output a decision. And the decision, would either be to change the action or change the beliefs, or in saying if there's a stress caused by dissonance, where you have certain modules of the brain sending different information to the central processor, that then the person would have to consider changing their beliefs, which I guess would be reverse back to one of the modules. But they're saying that that you have that, like,
Are they
chunking
saying that
theory.
the modules are like sub information that the central processor can reconfigure in alignment with these new beliefs that are somehow more accordant with the stimulus, presumably?
Yes, and so that's why cognitive dissonance has returned to being such a popular theory, because you could actually hypothesize neural mechanisms. So if you hypothesize that there's these different modules sending different signals, and it could be emotion, uh, memories, beliefs, and then a section of the brain that does higher order thought, and then feedback mechanisms that you could hypothesize neural mechanisms, and then you could test, at least through the neural correlates of consciousness, to witness these mechanisms taking place. And like I've said, some of these tests have demonstrated um, these neural correlates, and even like a modular type thinking, where a certain decision process would light up factors from different parts of the brain related to emotions and thinking and memory and sensory input, and then even to have neural correlates of a feedback mechanism, where there would be lighting. It would go to the the prefrontal cortex for processing, and then there would be a feedback mechanism where the processing goes back to the different modules that deal with specific things like emotion or visual memory, or various things. So that's why I say that cognitive dissonance, besides working psychometrically, has quite a bit of success and future prospects of exact neural mechanisms.
Well, it is assuming consciousness is emergent from the brain, maybe. Hard to tell.
Yeah, of course. That's not my presupposition, but I'm saying that as um, all scientific research on consciousness is basically materialistic, and so the
Yeah.
the research in cognitive dissonance is so successful that the majority of neurologists or philosophers of mind think that quantum consciousness is unnecessary, that they will be able to fully explain consciousness without needing any quantum phenomenon, that just the neuroelectric impulses will be enough, sufficient.
Huh.
And if T Jump may not, I'm not sure how much T Jump understands or knew, but I mean, T Jump knew enough to tell you that when he debated you, that you say quantum mind's unnecessary, that the direction of brain research is that you don't need quantum mind to explain the phenomenon of consciousness.
Yeah.
The neural correlates are sufficient.
Yeah. That's what he said. Pretty funny.
Yeah,
And he's got to
and I disagree on
periodically defend
I don't even
cosmological
think.
subtleties as well, like quantum fields being the predecessor to the Big Bang, and just added to the list of things he's got to recite without really knowing what the heck he's even saying. It's an obvious over assertion of it couldn't possibly be a reasonable representation of his knowledge basis to assert something with that much certainty.
Well, he's correctly asserting what the experts in the field are saying, and to say whether the brain could do a Bayesian analysis or not, it's like a Boolean, like I was saying, like Boolean circuit logic. That hypothetically, decision making and motivation could work through a predictive model and dissonance reduction, and that could all be done through Boolean circuits if the brain works in terms of Boolean circuits. There's no direct evidence that the brain operates
Well,
using
you
like.
could say the consciousness works according to Boolean circuits and that the brain is part of consciousness, but I don't know if you could say the brain operates according to Boolean circuits.
Yeah, that's what I meant, like the reverse anthropomorphism, because computers operate according to Boolean logic and circuits, and it's
I mean,
possible.
isn't cognitive dissonance basically saying that we operate on a 0-1 basis, but it's not classical logic because it involves denial of obvious facts? I mean, that's kind of the opposite of the spirit of classical logic, isn't it?
No, because it's cognitive dissonance is just a cost benefit analysis from various mental modules, so that you have components of the brain that are specialized to make predictions or understand the environment, or deal in certain ways, and they all send information to some sort of central processor in the brain that takes the information and makes a unitary decision of how we should control our body, or of a global belief, and that would operate according to Bayesian analysis, and that it's very reasonable to assume that the neurons form basic Boolean circuits, and the way that the brain does it is the same way the computer would do it, and that you have modules of the brain that perform certain functions, and then that information is sent to a central processor that makes a singular cost benefit analysis with a feedback mechanism.
Have they said where that is in the brain?
I mean, I think it'd be in the prefrontal cortex, where they would assume that that would be where the Bayesian, and that's because the neural correlates. And so you could see in decision making that there would be, certain neural correlates that would have various, lighting up coming from certain components of the brain that are believed to correlate with certain functions like emotions, or, and then it would go to the prefrontal cortex, and then there's even a feedback mechanism that feeds back into it. But whether that, that's just the neural correlates, so that the brain theory, like, oh, the brain probably operates just like a computer, and those are sections of the brain that do a certain processing, sends it to the central processor, and then the central processor takes that, makes a decision on how it's going to control the body, or like language, what we're going to say, and then there's a feedback mechanism that would go back to the components and possibly rewire them. Um, but I mean, we don't know. There's no evidence that the brain actually does it, but there's just a neural correlate, and so it's the reverse anthropomorphization, that just saying, well, we know computers do it, and brains and neurons are a lot like are potentially the same thing as Boolean logic circuits. So let's just assume that's what the neurons are doing, is they're acting as logic gates and circuits, and that's what's happening when we see the neural correlates.
Okay.
So that's the current dominant theory and saying we don't need any quantum. You don't need to come onto quantum mind because the neurons are sufficient if they operate as uh, your logical circuits, Boolean logic, so but I say that's hypothetical that we don't know that neurons serve a function of Boolean circuit logic, but it's conceivable that they do, and if they did, the neural correlates would match what a computer does in terms of the modular mind, where the different modules of the mind, like so if they test a person, I mean, I shared the things at the beginning. You could see, when the person first has the stimuli, that the parts of the brain light up, and then it travels to the prefrontal cortex, and then there's a feedback going back to the various modules of the brain. That's the hypothesis of what we're seeing, but it matches the neural correlates of what we're seeing. The theory of of the reverse anthropomorphization of the human mind to the computer corresponds to the neural correlates.
I'm having trouble with the link from a bunch of different neural synapses that are Boolean to a single central processor. But it's no problem. I've always had trouble with that.
Well, I mean, that's
I
because
do think there's a way in which our
maybe you
mind
need to study your
functions
computer science,
very
because I'm talking
binary.
about the reverse anthropomorphization.
What about it? Just the way in which we think that's similar to computers. We tend to evaluate a finite number of possibilities and choose between what we perceive as a finite number of possibilities, and that is also what a computer is doing.
Well, I think it's a reverse anthropomorphization, and maybe because you haven't studied enough computer science, we know how the computer operates. And so when a computer, if you use the word thinks or processes, this is how the computer does it. And so it's a reverse anthropomorphization to just hypothesize that maybe the brain works in the same way that a computer does. And then you have the evidence of the neural correlates of consciousness that gives some sort of vindication that it's possible the brain is doing the same thing that the computer doing. And from the technology that we have to monitor and read the brain, what we would expect to see light up in terms of the neural correlates light up for this module processing, that areas of the brain light up. It leads to the prefrontal cortex, and then it leads back to the modules in a similar way that a central processor in a computer works.
Well, I think the issue is subsistence of the partitions over time. Because for a particular experience, I don't doubt it can be broken into partitions of some sort, but then to say that the structural partition identified across a particular experience can be then generalized as the recognizer of the whatever it is the consciousness is recognizing, that's the hard step to make, but interesting nonetheless.
And just assuming that the neurons have some sort of function as like binary logic gates. That's just a hypothesis. It could be that neurons have some sort of function in the same way that computer circuits do, but that hasn't been demonstrated.
I misunderstood what you said because it seemed like you just said one thing and then the exact opposite, and that can't be right. So you're saying that hypothesis is reverse anthropomorphism of computers, and it hasn't been falsified, but it hasn't been proven either? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, there's no evidence that neurons operate as logic gates.
But
Like
that's
binary processing logic gates. It's
okay.
possible that they do, and there's a lot of reason to think that they do. Um, but there's no direct evidence that neurons have that function. They
Is
could
that what
have
these
that
models
function.
are is that part of these models, would you say?
That's the mainstream model of the predictive mind in the Fristian Bayesian analysis brain, is that the neurons are
Awesome.
essentially binary logic gates. And that's why I said that quantum mind is unnecessary. If the neurons function as binary logic gates, then and that's sufficient to explain consciousness, quantum mind's unnecessary.
Could you imagine taking that position in a debate?
That's the mainstream position. I don't know who would you like. I mean, I don't even think T Jump may be smart enough to argue the mainstream position, but I don't think he knows enough science or mathematics. So I showed that debate at the beginning. Um, a predictive mind. But you would need someone. I think I could take that position in debate. It's not my position, but I think I could take that position in debate. Just for the purpose of debate, that I could argue that the brain is a Bayesian, um, logic circuit, and consciousness arises from it.
There's 86 billion neurons in the brain. So
Yes,
if
if
the
neurons
neuron
serve a function as
is doing
logic
Boolean
gates,
logic, if there's 86 billion neurons worth of computations happening, we don't have access to that level because what we experience isn't of the order of 86 billion things. It's more like one thing perceiving a vista, if you will.
well, I mean, most of the experts think that the number of neurons, if neurons serve the function of logic gates, that the number of neurons is more than sufficient to produce consciousness. And I said that's based on reverse
Okay.
anthropomorphization, that we know what a computer in circuits in a computer could produce. So if neurons function as logic gates, then as binary logic gates, then most experts hold that that's sufficient to produce consciousness.
I see now what they mean by consciousness as emergent. So the emergent consciousness is the cogito, is more of the style of cogito type thing, i.e., the result of processes in the brain or folding in these 86 billion neurons worth of computations that somehow together through, is it okay, cost benefit analysis? How does that then connect to cost benefit analysis? Maybe we're going too deep into the specificities of it, but it's all very interesting.
Well, I
And
mean,
we'll probably,
what it's basically saying is the brain is a computer and operates the exact same way that computers operate. And you still have the hard problem of consciousness in terms of experience and explaining, like, what does it mean to feel to be me or to feel pain. That would still be a question. But in terms of like the cost benefit analysis of how is there a me that controls the body and that has perceptions and make decisions, and leads into the eliminativist perspective, and that it would be that we are factually uh, a mechanical being without free will, and that I just feel like I make decisions, but it's really just a Bayesian analysis being conducted in my prefrontal cortex, and like we're basically an automaton. and there's some other, but that would be, the kind of understanding of the cost benefit analysis is that there's just some sort
And
of
there's no
greater.
room in there for God to have made you an automaton?
Well, you can have the theology, but it's not necessary. It'd be more evolution, and they would say it's in line with evolution in that there's no purpose to it, that it wasn't purpose driven, like evolution would posit that it's um, but yeah, I mean, it was just like quantum mind. It's not necessary, and the God aspect's not necessary because they would hold that evolution uh, is sufficient to explain it without God.
That's another position I wouldn't want to take.
Well, it's the mainstream position.
Yep. Evolution. From simple to complex, I
That's
guess.
what you used to have in the intro. You got rid of the intro, but science not only says consciousness is impossible, that consciousness is like this extreme eliminativist model that it's just a Bayesian analysis that resolves our dissonance, and there's no actual me that makes decisions.
Well, couldn't you just say that the Bayesian analyzer is the you making the decisions? No? Because it doesn't have any existence past materiality then, I guess.
Yeah, I mean the Hebrew philosopher kind of when it put in to say that um, free will necessitates the ability to choose the less popular option. I mean the less desired option. So if it's just a Bayesian analysis, and we end up doing whatever has the highest ratio, or there's a brink point for cognitive dissonance, and once it passes the brink, that's what we do.
Yeah, threshold. I
Threshold,
like the
and so
thermostat model
there's
for
no
that.
decision that we make. It's just a threshold, and if it's passed, it's passed. If it's not passed, it's not passed.
Well, that's what a decision is. Like, just because we can decompose a decision doesn't mean it wasn't a decision. It just means that now you have a better understanding of what a decision entails. Not to be
No, I
overly,
mean,
cheesy or anything, but
a decision implies that you could go against the threshold, that it's not just a Bayesian analysis and whatever has the highest value is what gets done, is that there's some sort of controller that could go against um, the Bayesian analysis.
and maybe some of these theories sort of say that a little bit with the higher order processing, just not very.
Well, it's a question of free will. If there's a formula and we follow the formula, there's no decision being made. Even if the formula is
Yeah.
extremely complicated, that there's just a formula, and our brain permeates and computes the formula, and that's what we do. Uh, as opposed to like a free will perspective, that if there's a formula, we could go against the recommendation of the formula, um, based off of free will decision. That the Bayesian analysis could appear, and there could be a threshold, but I still have some sort of decision making power to do what goes against the recommendation of the Bayesian analysis, and it's not based on some sort of higher order rules that are pre-wired into my brain. And that's I argue that say that that I'm a dualist, that I believe that there's a non-material entity that does that, and that's why so to say it's not formulaic, that there might be some sort of formula of a cost benefit analysis but that's not determinative of what we do. There's some sort of controller entity that is not determined by the which side of the formula is bigger or not.
Good point. I mean, it's very appealing that something could be made equational, but realistically, there's very few things that can meaningfully be equationalized.
Well, no, I'm saying that's the reverse anthropomorphization. So you have all, that's like the Grossbergian resonant brain. So all the computation that the brain is making, and so to say, it would resonate and it would settle upon a frequency, and there would be conflicting frequencies. But through some sort of process, it would settle on a frequency, and that frequency would determine our choice. And it's not a matter of free will or decision making. It's something that is you're determined through mathematical, physical, mechanical laws.
I'm sort of stuck at frequency. To me, that means change. And a choice, to me, is a stopping of the potential for change. Not saying that,
I'm talking about the
yeah.
Grossberg's resonant mind, which would probably also be modular. So you have the various modules of the mind that resonate at different frequencies so say that we're interpreting the meaning that they're resonating at different frequencies, that they're sending conflicting signals. And those conflicting signals would go to the central processor, and the central processor would settle on one of the frequencies to resonate with, and then that would become the dominant frequency that would determine our action.
So the frequency holds the information about the action. And there's a range of frequencies, and when there's a decision, that's settling into one of the frequencies.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Grossberg's resonant mind model,
Cool.
which might correlate with like that's the mainstream is the Fristian Bayesian analysis, and that you have that you could have a Bayesian analysis conducted within the module, but the module does a Bayesian analysis and then sends a coherent signal to the main processing center, and the main processing center does a Bayesian analysis with the various signals sent from the different modules, and then that would coordinate a unified um, decision. And it'd be more complicated that there might be a feedback mechanism also, in that the modules that are sending information that is being rejected would have some sort of feedback that might change the modules based on that.
Very interesting stuff. Have you heard or read much into this warm, wet, noisy allegation? Basically, an argument against quantum mind, that it wouldn't be able to sustain any effects.
Yeah, and actually, someone in Luke, that was the Max Tegmark. I actually even bought Tegmark's book.
Was it Max Tegmark who made that argument originally?
I think so.
That's a
I have to.
I was just thinking that might be an interesting topic, because there have been a lot of people that have responded to that.
I mean, Tegmark is one of the main thinkers of the multiverse, but I think he also critiqued quantum mind, and that's why I mentioned that Penrose's quantum mind, uh, the collapse of the wave function, Penrose, previous to working on the mind in the 70s already, worked out a possible solution to the collapse focusing on gravity. Uh, but the alternative to the Penrosian model of the collapse is the multiverse. And so Tegmark is in the opposing school of quantum mechanics. In the multiverse, Penrose is in the other school of the collapse, specifically of gravitational, and then applying that to mind. So that Tegmark would be from sectarianism different with Penrose Hameroff.
So I guess you don't think it's worth writing up on, Stu? It's like not interesting enough. I guess I was thinking about your. Do you have other pillars of MTH or just cognitive dissonance at this point?
I had other pillars. I mean, I mentioned my video. Just going back, I put this in. This is pretty complicated. Let me just see if I find this. With Penrose.
Everyone in the chat is saying we only have deterministic free will. That's weird. I've never heard that before, but all right.
Okay, yeah. So Diassi and Penrose. Yeah, so here it's from last week. So quantum mechanics is complicated by the famous measurement problem related to Schrodinger's equation and the collapse of the wave equation. Diassi and Penrose had forwarded an objective collapse theory to the measurement problem centering around gravity as opposed to the multi-world theories. So objective collapse theory is, so to say, one of the solutions to the measurement problem that leads to the quantum mind. In fact, the quantum mind Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis is based on objective collapse theory of the wave equation. However, there's an alternative understanding to objective collapse theory, and that's the multi-world. So basically, you're saying you have the wave equation, and it has a spectrum of possibilities, and then we're hypothesizing that it collapses, and we have one of those possibilities becomes what actually is occurring in the physical world. And so Penrose has a model that's called an objective collapse theory of how the wave equation collapses into one various outcome, and that he specifies it's through relationship to gravity. So Tegmark is from the multiverse theory that doesn't agree that there's an objective collapse and that it doesn't objectively collapse to one value, but leads to the multiverse hypothesis. So if you're following what I'm saying.
I am. It sounds like it's a difference of interpretation as to what the collapse of the Schrodinger equation means physically.
Well, I'm saying the multiverse is a rejection that there is a collapse.
But it's not a rejection of a Schrodinger equation.
Yeah,
so they're both looking at the mechanics of the system dictated by the Schrodinger equation, but they're interpreting it differently in terms of what it means for it to collapse.
So I'm not sure if the multiverse would be proper to say it collapses. It doesn't collapse.
But there's still a Schrodinger equation representing the state of the system at a given time that's a function of its space-time.
Yeah,
in both of those cases.
objective collapse theory says it collapses and hypothesizes how it collapses. So if does the multiverse theory reject that it collapses, or it says it collapses? Uh,
No,
so
it rejects that it collapses. I've been corrected on that. It doesn't reject the Schrodinger equation, though, but it rejects that it collapses. It's something else that isn't a collapse that somehow leads to all the multi universes coalescing into a single experience.
yeah, so Tegmark is from the multiverse school, and he critiques Penrose not just on the quantum mind. He critiques because the quantum mind is based. The quantum mind necessitates uh, the objective collapse theory. It's called orchestrated objective reduction, OR, and Hamerov is saying that the microtubules is the mechanism that of the reduction. So the dispute between Tegmark and Penrose is the precursor to the orchestrated reduction, because he's saying that the collapse doesn't happen at all in the first place. At least I think, and then you would have, the wet, warm, noisy critique. So Tegmark's critique on Penrose Hamerov is twofold. One on the whole understanding of whether there's a collapse of the wave function at all, and it's probably more in depth than that. That it then and then of the so it's pretty complicated, and so but it goes back
How
to the
much have
way.
you read about the renormalization problem?
I'm not sure, that's not sounding familiar to me.
There is an axiom of the one of the postulates of the Copenhagen interpretation is that a differential calculus expression of the assertion essentially that the probability of observation is 1. And so if you integrate these operators representing observables over whatever space, the probability of like you're calibrating your observables to the experiment. There are issues with that in quantum, and I think broadly is referred to as the renormalization problem is that you're always having to renormalize to keep that condition. And it sort of begs the question like, well, where's the force of this renormalization? And possibly erroneous interpretations, as it seems you definitely don't buy into this multiverse thing.
Yes, I mean, cognitive dissonance is one of the pillars of the multiple truth hypothesis. Another pillar is the computer algorithms of truth discovery. Another pillar is the wave equation and the measurement problem, specifically related to whether there's a collapse of the wave function and how that works. So that, like, the multiverse, multiple truth hypothesis, does the wave function collapse, and what does it collapse to? And like we have a multiple, truth hypothesis in so uh, the wave equation is also a fundamental pillar of the multiple truth hypothesis. And then I also, like, in my videos, I put as the generic philosophy of science and empiricism. So, like, on a pure metaphysical level, that even the wave equation is a product of mind observing the physical world. So you'd have another pillar of the multiple truth hypothesis that would be on the level of philosophy of science and empiricism in general, of pure thought. But yeah, those are the main pillars: cognitive dissonance, the wave equation, um, truth discovery functions, and the philosophy of science. four main pillars. And
Well,
so I'm not taking.
I know you've mentioned truth discovery a bunch of times. I didn't know you had a construct of a wave function. And philosophy of science, uh, that's pretty vague, but I'd love to know more about what you're talking about there.
Well,
It's really
it's
good in
in
your
the realm
writing.
of philosophy because I'm not taking a position like, I mean, if you're on the side of the objective collapse as opposed to the multiverse, I'm not taking a side in that debate. But the concept of the wave equation is in line with the multiple truth hypothesis that we have that truth is a wave function of a realm of possible truths. That it may collapse to one single truth, but that's a pillar of the multiple truth hypothesis of this fundamental concept of understanding reality in terms of a wave function, a realm of possibility that may or may not collapse to one single possibility. So that the multiple truth hypothesis would work in a similar manner to the wave equation. In fact, like hopefully I'll be able to actually create a wave function form of the multiple truth hypothesis. Truth discovery function is an algorithm of a computer to that would be trying to assign a value between 0 and 1 through some sort of algorithmic function. And then cognitive dissonance specifically refers to human action. And so the philosophical would refer to the basic level of how do we define truth. And that would be, metaphysics. So a pillar of the multiple truth hypothesis in the pure realm of metaphysics.
Are you going to go into ontology and epistemology too, or you want to leave those blank?
Well, I put that in the category of metaphysics, that we're looking at the precursors to how do we know that we even exist or that there is a truth or approach uh, mind or understanding at all. Because
Are you going
the
to
wave
truncate that
equation.
at another teacher's? Are you going to say like I'm going to defer to the authority of this school past this point or anything?
Well, no, because it's the multiple truth hypothesis is a framework to look at all schools. So it's not going to lend. So you don't have to. It's not going to direct people to take one side or the other. So I mean, the Schrodinger. So if you want to look at it as levels, where the first level of metaphysics doesn't necessitate the reality of the material realm. We're looking at purely the level of thought where we recognize that it's possible that the material realm doesn't actually exist. The level of the Schrodinger, the
So you're
wave
saying that
equation.
this first level is the same as the Schrodinger level?
No, because the wave equation presumes that the physical world is a reality. So the metaphysical level would say that possibly,
So you're
like the way.
speaking in more of a sense of solipsism.
No, I'm just talking about fundamentals. So I'm starting with the pure fundamentals start with metaphysics. So you need,
Sure.
like, how do we know what act, like I was trying to, you're talking about the
Yeah, we
origins
can't
of logic
establish
versus
materiality here.
mathematics. The Schrodinger's equation, the wave equation, necessitates logic and mathematics. So the wave equation operates in the realm of mathematics and logic. So the first level is on metaphysics, where we establish that would have to establish such a thing as mathematics or logic for something even like the wave equation to operate in. And
Okay.
then,
So metaphysics, basically, we've got ground, and now you're going to talk about truth.
yes, I'm saying the metaphysics level is a precursor to the physics level because physics needs logic and mathematics and certain assumptions about truth to operate. So you have to start with the metaphysics of what is math, what is truth, what is logic
So,
to
like,
have.
really easy questions, right?
Well, I'm saying those are the most difficult of all the questions.
Yeah, I agree. Well, they're up there in the secular. I think theological questions are ultimately more difficult, and that's a
So those
secular
those are the
question, but it's up
theological
there.
questions. You call it metaphysics, but I'm saying that's the first level of establishment of first principles, and if you want to call it theological, metaphysical, the nature of truth, the nature of higher order rules. And once those are established, you could reach the order of material laws, and that would be the realm of the wave equation. And from there, it would split into two prongs of machine and mind. And cognitive dissonance would be in the realm of mind, and the truth discovery function would be in the realm of machine. So it would be thought or intelligence in the realm of human intelligence, and then the realm of computer intelligence. So, computer intelligence would be the truth discovery function, and the human intelligence and cognitive dissonance.
Sorry, what was the very last thing you said?
So, the first principle is the establishment of higher order rules like metaphysics, theology, mathematics, logic. The second principle is material law, the wave equation. And the third level is split into two of human intelligence and machine intelligence. And I'm using for machine intelligence the truth discovery algorithm as the basis of machine intelligence, and human intelligence using cognitive dissonance.
And are you looking to make a model between truth discovery and cognitive dissonance? Or correspondence relations, or whatever we're going to call them?
Well, I mean, it's a multiple truth hypothesis, so it's uh, stipulating the limits of human potential to answer the questions, and the best we could do is wrestle with the multiple truths, the multiple axioms, and possibly give some sort of estimation, or like the wave equation, a likelihood that it could, like the wave equation, it could collapse. You have multiple truths in a wave equation that might collapse to a single truth for the reality that's chosen. Um, but the greater truth is the equation, the wave equation, not the collapse. And I mean, the metaphor is limited because saying the collapse of the wave equation is already disputed. That is saying that that's just if you look in even mainstream physics, that whether the wave equation collapses or not is a matter of dispute. So that the multiple truth hypothesis isn't postulating to answer these questions; it's creating a framework for what I'm. The meaning of the hypothesis is that we're not going to answer these questions. We're going to have to deal with the uncertainty, and the best we could do is estimate the uncertainty, or
Estimation of
navigate
uncertainty.
navigate the uncertainty.
Like a
So
signal to noise ratio for uncertainty, maybe.
Well, those are just metaphors. I mean, you give metaphors.
A signal
So
to noise ratio is not a metaphor if you're able to measure the amplitude of whatever we're talking about.
well, I said the multiple truth hypothesis is going to be overarching template for all thought. So you can't give a realm of wisdom as a metaphor for the collective framework for all wisdoms. And that's what I'm saying. So from the aspect of human mind, it might come out as cognitive dissonance. From the aspect of machine intelligence, it would come out as a truth discovery function.
I see where you're going with it.
And saying it's not like one's going to be the answer. Saying that it's saying it's the multiple truth hypothesis. You're not going to get an answer. You're going to get multiple truths. And at best, you'll have some sort of wave equation of a probability curve of these multiple truths. That's the best you're going to get, and that's what the multiple truth
Couldn't you
hypothesis.
say that like electron shells are multiple truths of position?
Well, I mean, so if you're giving a metaphor, so if you extrapolate the metaphor of the wave equation related to the position of an electron and take that to the wave equation as the nature of truth. So the wave equation generally was devised as a method for the location of a particle, but it's saying to take that same wave equation and take it back a few metaphysical levels to the nature of truth. And so you would have, if whatever the first principles are, you would have like a wave equation of the first principles. And so, like, let's say uh, and that's even just a metaphor, because the first principles, I mean, you're saying math is going to arise at some point, and that's going to be one possibility of multiple truths. So to use that one possibility to explain a deeper level of truths is a fallacy.
Yeah, well, what constitutes a fallacy depends on the school of interpretation. It's not really clear at what point a fallacy has been committed, right? So
Well, I'm saying you can't use a
non-trivial.
derivative. You can't use a derivative of axioms to derive axioms.
Why? I'm not saying I disagree. I just want to know why you think that.
Because I'm saying you to establish first principles, and saying so you're going to have axioms of assumed first principles, and from those first principles to devise some sort of method like mathematics or logic, and then to use that method of mathematics or logic to devise first principles is because it's already based on assumptions. I mean, it's already based that like where do you get your first
On some
principles
level,
from?
the assumptions can't negate themselves in terms of the information they can create within their own presuppositional structure, perhaps.
So if you have your first level of multiple truth hypothesis, what are the first principles? And so there's multiple truths of what the first principles are, and of the multiple truths of the first principles, you could make derivatives based on those first principles. But the derivative of the first principles, then you're going to try to go back to the first principles, um, but you already locked yourself in by choosing from a variety of first principles.
I see.
If you had chosen different first principles, though that would have led to different methods or conclusions. And so if you try to use the derivative of the first principles to derive first principles, that's you see you can't do that. I mean, you could do it, but it would lower the truth value of it.
Well, I think within
So if
one
you say if
iteration.
you use the
So the
derivative of
metaphor
the
that
first
we have,
principle
you
to try
can't
to
use.
derive a first principle, it lowers its truth value.
If we go with the metaphor that we have, and I want to go back to what you said and make sure I understood it, but the metaphor I think we have access to is math. And it's definitely the case that math can't establish its own truths. Maybe if you start bringing in physics, but just math on its own, you can
Well,
isolate a
no, that's why I
value
saying
of
the
X.
first level is metaphysics. And if you're going to try to claim that mathematics is the first principles,
I was
um,
using math as a metaphor. No, I was trying to get to your question about what makes sense as a presumption with regards to approaching this question in the first place.
well, so that's what the multiple truth hypothesis is saying, that even the question of first principles, you're going to have multiple truths of what these first principles are. And so if you
Right.
take something as the first principles, then you have the derivatives of the first principles, and then you're going to try to use the derivatives of the first principles to derive more first principles, then that would lower the truth value of those derived first principles because they were derived from um, the derivatives of first principles, so it would have a lower truth value.
Because
So
if there's an inconsistency in the first, since the second follows from the first, it's like a sampling bias type of thing, a sampling. It is what amounts to a sampling error that is
well,
duplicated by
uncertainty would
multiple
increase
iterations.
in each. The uncertainties increase in each derivation. So if you say the first principle, there's uncertainty in the level of the first principle. So you're saying these are the first, the multiple truth hypothesis. Let's say you would have an infinite set of all the possible first principles. And for a various school based on a subset of first principles. So you have the infinite set of all possible first principles. And then you're going to have, call a truth school, which is going to be a subset of the infinite set of all first principles. They're just saying these are the first principles. That is this select subset of all the possible first principles. And because you've selected a certain subset of first principles, that implies that all the other principles are not first principles. Either they're going to be either they're false and not true principles, or they're going to be derivatives of the first principles. And then if they have some sort of value, that they would have a lower value if they're a derivative than a part of the subset than the first principle. So if you have an infinite set of all possible first principles, and then you're saying it's not necessary to have an infinite set of first principles, you only need a certain subset of first principles, and you could put the value of all the other elements in that set to zero. Um, but you still have the infinite set of all principles. So if you're saying the infinite set of all principles, many of those you're saying it will be zero because they're false principles. But some of them are not going to be zero, but they're going to be derivatives of the first principles. So they didn't need to be in the set of first principles because they could be derived from,
Okay,
so
well, just hold on. You're starting with an infinite set, and then you're breaking it down to a linear combination, and then you're further breaking it down to like a basis type thing. Is
so
that
each
correct?
level you have uncertainty, you have multiple truths, and so just what are the first principles? So it's like hypothetically,
When you said hypothetically, there's infinite, and then you hypothetically truncate that to the set of principles that are actually meaningful. And then I was trying to see if you were further truncating it again based on some like basis vector reduction scheme. That's what I was trying to understand.
yeah, so either you're reducing, so you have the infinite set of all possible first principles, and then you're creating a subset of saying just these first principles. Hypothetically, let's say it's just one or it's five or it's 10. So what about the infinite set of other possible first principles? So you're saying that you could reduce them to zero because you say they're false, or
You could reduce them to 0 for a particular application, maybe.
or
But
you
you could
could
also argue you could keep inventing languages and then have a literal infinite number of what you're describing in terms of
yes, or you could
presumption
tier
or
them
whatever.
to the second level. You're saying they're not they were you had the infinite set of possible first principles, but you excluded them from the set of first principles because really they're derivatives of a subset of first principles. So from the infinite set of possible first principles, if you chose a subset of first principles, and then you would hypothesize that from the infinite set of possible first principles, that many of those, a subset of those could be derivative of the subset of first principle. So they weren't, zeroed as false and not principles at all. They were just zeroed as first principles because they're derivatives as opposed to um, base principles.
So you're not on the fundamental level, you're only simplifying on the level of structural redundancy, not ideological. You're still saying you could map with this set, you could map to any principle, but you're reducing it in the interest of computation to just the set that can generate the rest of the sets.
Yeah, so if you look at, okay, let's say hypothesize the first principle of math and logic. Then I say, well,
Well, which one are you talking about? Because those are actually not quite, and there's also computation in there. So
even say, so let's say the first principle, math, logic, and computation. But then if you say, well, logic is the only necessary first principle
one
because
advantage to that is you could do a historical review talking about computers and calculators under that trichotomy. Just a thought.
I'm not talking about a paper or something, I'm talking about a metaphysics of understanding truth. So if you need multiple first principles of computation, math, and logic, um, but that's you're saying it's a multiple truth hypothesis. So it's also possible that you only need logic and that computation and math are derivatives of logic. So the only first principle you need is logic, and computation and math are derived from logic and are second principles. And so here you
Yeah.
already have, theoretically you have two different schools, one where the first principle is logic on its own and math and computation are derivatives of logic, and one where you have three first principles of math, computation, and logic, implying that computation and math can't be derived from logic. They're first principles because they can't be derived from logic. If they could be derived from logic, they don't need to be a first principle. They're derived. They're derivative. So here you already have two possibilities. You have the two possibilities of just one first principle of logic and then derivative principle of logic, mathematics, and computation. And then you have the possibility of three first principles that can't be derived from any of the other first principles, math, computation, and logic.
I'm sure you could
And
think
if
of
you,
even more than that, but at least that many for sure.
what you're saying, it would be in reality, it would be an infinite set. There would be an infinite set of all possible first principles, and then you might even have an infinite regression of all possible combinations of first principles and derivative principles. So you could say that of the infinite set of first principles, you have an infinite possibility of one of those being the first principles and all of the others being derivable from that first principle. And then you have the subset of any combination of first principles and all the others being derivative from those. So the multiple truth hypothesis would, that would be like, so to say, the wave equation of the possibility of the infinite set of all first principles, and then from there, that the possibility that it would collapse to one single first principle, that everything else is derivatable from that, and the probability curve of the likelihood that it was collapse on one of them or any combination of them.
So the model, the umbrella for the simulation of the multiple truths is the wave function. It's encoding the information associated with the set of all possible, I want to say suppositions, but that's not what you said. Axioms.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's going to be paradoxical because to give a definition, you're going to be assigning it as a first order principle. But yeah, you have some sort of the infinite set of all first order principles. And that was my supposition when I wrote the formula on the first video, that there'd be some sort the integral of the set of all possibilities, and the derivative would equal one in terms like the wave equation. But so I mean, and to even paradoxically to even write it out in mathematical notation, because mathematics is just one of the possible um, infinite set of first order principles. So I mean, even to write it is paradoxical in its first place like that. But I'm saying hypothetically, you have an infinite set of all possible first order principles, and from there you have possibilities that it's possible that there's one first order principle that all other principles are derivatable from. It's possible that nothing's derivatable from anything else, and the set is just there's infinite amount of first order principles and no derivatives, or anywhere in between where you have a certain subset of first order principles of which everything else is derivatable, and you have infinite regression of infinite second order, third order your principles ad infinitum, and so you would have, but that would be the totality of the multiple truth hypothesis, looking at that infinite regression. And so if I wrote it in mathematical form, that's paradoxical in nature because that's pre-assuming mathematics is a first order principle.
So are there going to be any examples in the book, or would those all be presuming too much metaphysical baggage?
Well, yeah, I mean, you have to start, so you have to so I would have to explain like a limitation. So I mean, I recognize the limitations of the system or notation, but like to make progress, we're still going to use a limited system. So it's saying the theory is greater than the limitation of the language to explain it. So I would try to use the language to explain the limitations of the language, and then I would use language to the best of my ability to explain the systems, having explained that the system is actually bigger than the limits of language allows to describe.
Deborius says possibility could be paradoxical just because paradoxical exists. Well,
Yeah, I mean, so you have an infinite amount of first order principles, and so if you have contradiction, paradox of of this infinite set of principles, and so that includes x and not x. So if so can the first order principle include both x and not x, even though they're paradoxical? Well, it has to, because it's the
yeah.
infinite set of all first principles, and that includes x and not x. They both have to be elements of the same set.
Well, if it's
And so that,
infinite in that sense, then it couldn't exclude anything. So yeah, any assertion that something was excluded from this set would be false by virtue of the definition of the set.
yeah, I mean, so for set theory, that's non-contradictory. It doesn't matter. You could have a set of
An
X and not
infinite
X.
set may be contradictory under certain frameworks, but I wouldn't say necessarily.
I mean, it's not a contradiction in terms of set theory to have a set that includes X and not X
No,
as
not
elements of the same set.
necessarily, unless you're saying it's a set of propositions that can't contradict each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's logic. Like set theory is
Yeah,
not
so
logic.
that's not
So
what you're talking about. You're talking about a set in the most general sense of what could be assigned. I don't know. You, I don't want to misquote you, but you said principles, right?
well, I mean, any of these are going to be a limitation of vocabulary. So I mean, at the end of the day, you have to go with something truths. So I call it multiple truths. But principles, axioms, and so on the deepest level of metaphysics, we're going to call your first principles. That
Hmm.
like is there like mind, truth, physical realm, um, existence, non-existence, and these most basic axioms. So the infinite set of possibilities includes existence and non-existence, even though they're contradictory. So the first order of business is the establishment of the precursors of truth, and so that set is going to include contradictions like existence and non-existence are both going to be members of that set. And so you like a multiple truth hypothesis, it's, well, do you want to go down the path of existence or non-existence? And they're going to lead to different conclusions. But for the greater framework of truth, that you started with a set that included existence and non-existence. And so for the sake of you could call one 1 and one 0, and so they're both members of a set, but one has a value of 1 and one has a value of 0. So just because it's a member of a set, it has no significance. You're giving it a value of 0, but it's still a member of the set.
Yeah.
And so I mean, this is pretty complicated, and so I'll probably have to
I
take
think
many
it's
more.
making sense to me. My thing has always been I've been stuck on how you reduce the domain of potentiality.
Well, because truth is greater than the limitation of language. So it's like an incompleteness theorem. You say,
I
well,
don't think I understand truth that way because, in my eyes, truth is something that could have been true, is something that could have been false. Whereas there's some stuff that, like, is sort of beyond a duality like that.
yeah. So it's a framework recognizing that truth is non-bounded by the limitations of language. We're the ones who are bounded by the limitations of language. So you're creating a framework to describe something in a system that's inherently too limited to describe what you're trying to describe.
So you're
But it's
just
still it's still a
shoving
useful
infinity in the
framework.
beginning as a way to kind of remind people that we can't describe it.
Well, it's just the axiom of the theorem would have to work with the recognition of the limitations. So like what is truth and what are our limitations? And
Yeah,
then
I'm going a
based
step further and I'm saying so this concept of infinite possibility is a way to do that.
well, I don't know if it's a way to do it. I'm saying it's a hypothesis of the nature of truth, or at least the nature of our ability to understand truth. So you have what truth actually is, and then you have the limitations of our ability to try to find that truth. And so that's the multiple truth hypothesis is working within our limitations. And that's why it's the multiple truth hypothesis, because of our limitations. So it's possible there's a truth, but due to our limitations, we have a multiple truth hypothesis because that's the best we could do.
Because the truth is too complicated, or because we're too simple?
When we put it, we're too simple because we're limited. And so just, start with the precursor, the infinite set of all possibilities that includes contradictions like existence and non-existence. So due to our limitations, we have to work with one or the other. So it's possible truth encompasses existence and non-existence at the same time. But due to our limitations, we're going to have to work with sets of truth of one. We can't work with existence and non-existence at the same time. We can only work with one or the other. We can't work with X and not X or any of these. We have to work with that's due to our limitations. But so to some extent, we could rise at least a little bit beyond our limitations through a framework that recognizes our limitations.
Are you going to write about that?
Well, if I'm writing an essay each week, I want to write a book on the multiple truth hypothesis. So I think next week I'm going to write probably just on chess decision making, on candidate move and analysis trees. So that's probably what I'm going to do next week. And then maybe the week after, I'm going to write on critical theory, the Frankfurt School and critical theory. Um, but yeah, hopefully eventually, I'll keep on writing, I'll keep on developing it, and you'll be able to turn it into a book. And at the same time, I'm studying various fields. So if I do, maybe this week easier, I'll do something I know pretty well, and I should be able to write up somewhat quicker. Like on the decision making, candidate moves, and analysis trees that refer like chess or flowing from debate. And I think I want to write on critical theory also, just because it's important, and it's also somewhat like critical theory, cultural relativism is also probably related to multiple truth hypothesis. But yeah, I'm going to try to write an essay every week, and at some point when I have like 20 of them, either there's going to be more crossover, and then I might start forming a longer papers, or maybe I'll even be at the point where I could, write something that is borderline publishable in a journal, like a short essay that once I have 20 essays, maybe I could combine 3 or 4 of them into a 10-page paper that would be, publishable. And then, at some point it would be, in range for, a year from now when I have 50 of them, that I would form them into chapters of a book, and eventually a book.
That's going to be really exciting to see the development and final product. I'm working on my ideas too. Unfortunately, they don't come out as nicely written essays. They tend to come out as diagrams, but eventually, hopefully, I'll be able to write some of that out in a way that is accessible.
Okay,
Yeah.
anything else you want to talk about?
Um. Well, we didn't really go into the Shankaracharya stuff, but it seemed like you kind of weren't interested in that, so no problem there.
Well, it interests me, but maybe it's a matter for a different streamer saying like, or saying you produce some content, or do some more research, but I don't know what you wanted to say about that.
I just like the idea of non-dualism being a good way to frame metaphysics. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts, but you already pretty much summarized it good chunk of it. So, did you read the whole thing or just skim it?
Well, I read both of them when you shared it. I mean, I guess skim, but like I tried to read, even sub vocalized, even like a little carefully, and that's why I meant like okay, like I was saying, ISKCON, it's an opposing school, and to some extent they're contradictory. So like from the multiple truth hypothesis, you would have the set of all possibilities that would include dualism and non-dualism. But they're contradictory, and then you have like Lord Chaitanya's Achintya Veda Veda, which is like dualism and non-dualism. But
Well, your MTH is saying they can be reconciled in a way.
I said they could be reconciled. It's just a framework for dealing with the possibilities. That is saying, okay, you're
Okay.
still, MTH is not going to change that people are still going to fall into one school or the other, but it's just going to say
Okay.
like
I got it.
to
Yeah.
say, okay, I recognize that the truth is greater than one school or the other, and to just deal with the fact like, okay, how would it be if I was chose this option or that option, and then to even you have like a truth value for various outcomes or interpretations. So as opposed to just arguing like I'm a dualist, I'm a non-dualist. Let's just keep on arguing. Saying to have a framework of multiple truth hypothesis to recognize the different approaches and implications, as opposed to just let's just keep on arguing of what's better, dualism or non-dualism.
So it shifts it so it makes the differences so self evident that there's no reason to have pointless arguments, potentially.
Well, no, it's just a framework to understand truth better.
Oh, okay, cool.
And saying, no, I don't think we're ever going to prove dualism or non-dualism.
I wasn't suggesting you could. I was trying to make sure I was understanding your intention. As you said, a framework. And to me, that's like a bridge. And that's what I meant when I said reconciled. But I get that that's not what you're saying. So I just want to be sure. But it looks like Duborius is a big fan and would read this book.
Yeah, I'm not claiming that I'm going to resolve or solve like a unification theory. It's just a framework, and really, it's kind of like a mental technique that say like, okay, um, you're a non-dualist, I'm a dualist, and
I
that,
accept all forms of dual. Like I accept a bunch of forms of dualism. I'm not like against dualism, just to be clear. But I get it.
yeah, because it's like a binary opposites that you basically have to make a choice for certain practical values of decision making, like cognitive dissonance. You can't have it both ways because they have different implications.
Well, doesn't that depend how much distance you can tolerate? Or are you kind of saying they're people can tolerate different amounts, but there's always a point where it triggers?
Well, we just use the metaphor of distance or even the practicality, but it's saying that there's different implications of whether there's dualism or not. And so you just say, well, I'm not sure. Like maybe it's dualism, maybe it's non-dualism, and I try to keep both in my head. But yeah, for a certain decision making, it will necessitate like the collapse. You have the collapse of the wave equation. You're going to have to. It's going to collapse to one side or the other. For certain points, like a
Mhm.
threshold of action, it's going to collapse one way or another. And so theoretically, for philosophical understanding, I'm looking at the wave equation without the collapse, but in terms of like personal decision making or myself, the wave equation is going to collapse. I'm going to have to one way or the other. Like eventually I'll die and I will be cremated or I'll be buried. The wave equation will collapse, even though in my mind, I may have been ambiguous and tried to understand both perspectives, but like I have one body and I'll have one death and I'll either be cremated or buried.
I see. Hmm. Well, this is me very interesting. It is so hard to know where to start with regards to framing a book. It's a great exercise, though. And you're definitely more talented at writing than me. So, yay.
Yeah, I'm not really a writer at all. Like, I mean, in fact, I had my mom proofread, and I printed out um, my previous essays. I'm going to give them to my mom to look at those also. But like, not, I mean, I'm educated. Like, I took classes on writing, and as I told you when you were pushing me to write, like, I've never written. Like, the only times I ever wrote were for assignments in university, like 10 papers period that I wrote in my whole career, and all of those I had my mom proofread for me. But yeah, I went to good schools, and I took courses on ethics, on the fundamentals of writing. Um, that it's like a wisdom that I was able to do it, but like no, I don't have any proclivity towards writing. That's why I stream. But yeah, to break myself and force myself to do it, and it was kind of based on your nagging. So glad you did. And now, I've written 5 papers, and hopefully I'll keep on writing one every week. And, it's like the collapse of the wave equation. Eventually I'll have a book, and it'll open up, and it's kind of like the
It's
nature
going to
of
be
chess.
so much better than anything like Dawkins' Tier.
Well, I mean, no reason to compare, like, just keep on pushing forward and do it. But, so next week I plan on writing on candidate moves and analysis trees. So, like why chess is a good example, because you can only make one move. So it's not like you don't have an infinite set of candidate moves. You have a limited set of candidate moves. And if you look in a chess position of all your possible moves, there might be tens at most, and sometimes it's a force sequence where you only have one possible move. But usually there's tens of possible moves, and you could limit that to a handful of reasonable candidate moves, rejecting the others as not good, not worth looking into. And then you have an analysis tree of your candidate moves where that go into, well, if I do this, then my opponent has these possibilities, and a back and forth that increases exponentially. So that's the concept of candidate moves and analysis trees, and it's similar to debate flowing. Like I could give this argument from a whole bunch of candidate arguments, and there might be an infinite set of possible arguments, but you could limit it to a handful of candidate arguments that appear, at least in our own mind, to be the most reasonable. And then if I gave these candidate any of those candidate arguments, there would be a conceivable infinite set of replies, but could be limited to a handful of likely replies that would exponentially increase. But in terms of like a chess, you're only going to get to make one move. So however many candidate moves there are, you're going to make one move, and your opponent's going to apply with one move. And most things in human action is there's one me that does one thing at one time. So even though there's an infinite potential of things that I might want to do, like to say, there's an infinite potential of words that I could say, expressions, but one thing's going to come out of my mouth at this very time. And so just like writing a book. So at this point, there's an infinite potential of ways I could go about writing my book, but it will come down to one book, and I will, have to choose one option. And that's part of the difficulty of writing.
Well, maybe you don't have to write just one book. I mean, if you're able to
But I
write
mean,
at
you
the
can write more
consistency,
papers and more books, but saying like it's like no, it's unlikely. I mean, you could do like revised addiction, but if I write a multiple truth hypothesis, it's not likely I'm going to write like 20 different multiple truth hypothesis books that all structure and order itself in different ways. I'm going to have to make a choice And like I could open up.
I wasn't suggesting you do that. I'm just saying it's such a broad reaching topic that I don't see how you could only write one book on it.
Well, no, it come out in one book, like of an introduction that will probably be somewhat biographical, like who I am, why I thought about this, how I thought about it, and then I'll have to come up with some sort of structure of chapters that will take multiple approaches. One, could be philosophical, one could be theological, one could be mathematical. I could have a chapter on interfaith, on flowing, on chess, and so maybe I'll have 10 chapters, and there'll be some sort of logical structure of how I organize it. Um, but yeah, but that's the process of writing a book or organizing. So it's too early right now to even think of chapters. So that's why it's good. I'm just writing essays, and when I have 50 essays, then I could look into how it, or I already have a book there, just how to organize it and put it together. So you could work the other way around, like try to make the framework in the chapters, and like the first chapter is going to be on first principles and theology and logic. The second chapter will be mathematical, third or whatever, and then there's also the communication theory of message, medium, and receiver. Like who's my target audience? Who am I trying to reach? Um, but it's likely that I'll first write a technical paper. So by the time I have like 5 or 6 essays on the multiple, maybe in like 2 months from now, God willing, if I keep on putting an article out a week, then I'll have 10, 20 articles that I'll be able to look into writing a formal article on the multiple truth hypothesis that would, like 10, 20 pages, cover the basics of it. And, like the book would probably be, like 200 pages. And, like, but yeah, it's good to get in the habit of writing. Um, and like, just, it's a lot of work just turning out like 2 pages. My essays have been like 2 to 3 pages, all of them, thousand, like 1,500 words. So just writing like 1,500 words, 2, 3 pages has been a lot of work. Like the research that I like put into really get the names and dates and orders and everything right. Like 10, 20 hours a week of research, and then just writing it's probably also like another 5 hours in terms from when I've like I write out on a little note card uh organizational like points, and so usually by like Wednesday I'll get a note card out and I'll start writing like main bullet points, and then Friday or Saturday I'll actually write it out based on the bullet points, and then I'll go over it a few times. So but from the point that I've writing out the bullet points on a note card or two, but once I've actually started writing, even that takes me a few hours. So like this week probably like like a good 3 4 hours of even after I started writing. And so hopefully as I do more I'll get better at it. And because I said, like, I never wrote, like, I wrote like 10 papers my whole adult life, all for school. And like, I always had a hard time doing it, pushed it off, or needed my mom's help. So, just force myself to do it. Hopefully, I'll get better at it and I'll get quicker at it.
The nice thing is, like, you're already really good. You're just coming in at a pretty good advantage, stats wise. I
Well, I mean,
think
thank God I had a University of Michigan education and I took these courses on edX. So, like, I haven't written, but I understand writing. Like I took courses, I've read books, I understand, and I read all the time. So like I'm familiar with writing, as I haven't done it myself. And then I've read books. I even took on edX like 10 different courses related to writing, and I understand the process of writing. So yeah, thank God.
You could
And
keep like an agenda or journal type thing that tracks the number of words you write per week as evidence of how well your MTH memory technique works. Duborius says that it's challenging to write about these topics because, well, because there is no absolute truth. I don't think you deny that. I mean, isn't it MTH basically to acknowledging that?
no, I mean, there might be an absolute truth, but it's saying it's beyond our grasp. So we could just have a framework, meaning like a collapse of the wave equation. That I'm not saying that there's not an absolute truth, saying that that's beyond our ability to decipher. That we could just frame, um, multiple truths. But I mean, it's possible that there's just. I mean, we discussed this before. Now it's okay. Like I paid $320 for us to go, and like I'm a middle aged man. Like if I had had a mainstream um life, like I would have kids going to college now, and I would have to pay like huge sums of money. And so I think like my parents, when I like I went to school, like University of Michigan, like I think course cost like about $2,000 in state. I think it was like $400 a credit hour when I was going there. It's like a 4 credit hour course was like $1,600, or maybe the first credit hour was more expensive. So like the first credit hour was like $1,200, and then it was like $400 each one after. So it was like $2,000 a course. Um, so yeah, I mean, thank God my parents, paid for me to go to school. Think like just $320 for the Science of Consciousness conference. And if I, if I had had a normal family life, I'm old enough, like my kids would be in college now, and it'd be a huge expenditure of money to pay for their education. But yeah, I mean, thank God for formal education where I, like have the precursors to write. And I took the courses on edX also that I did for free. So even if you didn't have, so to say, take high enough birth, where you had parents to pay for your college education, or maybe you could have a scholarship, but you could take on edX or read books on writing, and it's a good skill. I probably would have been better off if I developed it in my younger years. Just force myself to write. Um, like, but yeah, like at some
In
point,
terms of motivation, was it hard to find a motivation to write?
well, I just never had. The only time I ever wrote was when I had college papers. Like I never needed to write. I never had an audience. I didn't have anyone to that I thought would be interested in. So writing's difficult. It's very time consuming and mentally draining. And so just the fact that the that I didn't have any reason to do it, I didn't do it. And like if you really nagged me, like I wasn't going to do it. Even like you were telling me, I was like, you nagged me. I did it. I'm glad you did it. I did it because it's clearly the written word is probably the single most important, more important than the spoken word.
Well,
And
well, I wouldn't even go that far, but just for organizing your own thoughts, I mean, have you had any insight pursuant to the writing process?
no, okay, I think I understood the writing process. Like I've written, I studied
No, I mean
writing.
insight into your own, not insight about the writing process, about your own ideas through the action of the writing process.
Yeah, you see how well you understand your ideas. Even laying out um, how big the research is. To know, like to have a scientific paper, and you say the historical analysis. So I did. I'm not proposing my own theory of cognitive dissonance. So if I was proposing my own theory of cognitive dissonance, um, but so now I'm close to at least the introduction. If I was going to write a scientific paper on cognitive dissonance, that this paper I wrote this week might suffice, or is a decent amount of the work towards the historical analysis. and then like the progression, to understand progression of ideas. And I talk about these things, but to put it in writing is, you know, like the ramble, did people get it or not? You know, to writing when you have to read your own words and watching your own videos, that you know, like, no, I mean, definitely writing is probably, you know, the pinnacle of intellectual achievement.
Not
And
debate.
to force yourself to do it and to read over gives yourself the best feel of the state of your knowledge.
Maybe debate is a little harder than writing, but writing is something that speaking doesn't have, which is contemplation of structure. That's what I love about writing. I don't think you would be able to put forward a CD model within the confines of MTH. It just wouldn't seem to follow. Because I mean, you wouldn't get to CD without a bunch of suppositions, right? Or principles that would derive CD.
Um,
Like it's
well,
not
I'm
like
also,
a consciousness model where it follows from the axioms, like because it's a framework, nothing follows from it except the framework.
yeah, but there might be some insight, even like with a Fristian Bayesian brain, predictive brain, that um, it's possible that I'm almost at the point where I could even advance that I'm saying new things, even in terms of like mainstream theories. Like, let's say I was going to write a paper on the predictive brain as a Bayesian model, a Bayesian computer, and that I would be able to add things that, you know, even Carl Friston is saying with the multiple truth hypothesis. I mean, that's the point of writing and the research, to know, you know, like I say, I'm almost at the point where, you know, like I've done the historical analysis of multiple things. So I spent like 20 hours this week just on the research to do a thorough historical analysis of cognitive dissonance. You're reading, you know, and like you couldn't read all the material, and even an issue like cognitive dissonance, there's a, you know, probably, you know, too much probably even for one person to read, but the major articles in paper. And I haven't left a lot of stuff out of the essay that, you know, I didn't think it was necessary to just have like every, you know, all the main papers over decades on cognitive dissonance, or even going into the details of the tests. Um, but yeah, I mean, that's why, like, if you're a master's student, you have to publish and you have to do something unique. You have to be, you'll recognize the current state of scholarship and produce something new. And so if I'm at the point in my research on, you know, a topic like cognitive dissonance, where I've done enough research to recognize that I'm actually forwarding something new, and then I can even demonstrate it in a paper with a, you know, historical analysis and overview of the current thought, and why what I'm saying is new and unique and pushes the field of study forward. So it might, you know, I could see myself even being there, you know, maybe even in the next few months, even that I could look towards publishing a paper.
Absolutely no reason to doubt it. Always good to be optimistic. I figured out what I would do if I had a bunch of money to forward my consciousness studies as like a retreat where you can study meditation effects and therapeutic binaural beats that aren't bad for you potentially.
You know, we start buying a new computer.
Yeah, that's step one. Well, just because you asked me what I wanted, I remember the other time, and I couldn't think of anything offhand, but that would be really fun if I was going to research something scientifically, would be the effects of meditation. And to do that, you'd need probably, I don't know, some type of a facility.
Well, when we first started streaming, like I did my, when before we even I had you on my channel the first time we streamed, maybe we talked on Bab's cast, and then I did an overview of the Penrose-Hameroff hypothesis, and I mentioned in a paper that there were about 20 main models, theories of mind, of which half of them are quantum. Um, but like now, over a few years of research, to know, by name the models and the researchers and where they're holding to say, okay, I have my own theory of mind, and I'm conversant with all of the other major school theories of mind, and could say what's unique about my model or how it fits in with the research of the other models. So I mean, it's a significant amount of research and study, and just reading and up to date. And so we've been publicly doing this about 3 years, and I'd mentioned that like Friston and Penrose Hamerov and um, Coke and in these various names, just from the first papers I started reading, seeing these names, Prebaum, Tegmark, Penrose, um, to you have kind of like an encyclopedic like um, expertise, saying like, no, I know and then even at a certain point where I would, we attended the Science of Consciousness conference, at least online, not necessarily, maybe, people would recognize their name. We were in the chat as they go, like, even though they didn't chat anything, maybe they saw our names. And, maybe next year, in Italy, we attend it. It's possible, maybe next year, the Science of Consciousness conference is going to be in Italy, and, we attend it. Or that, like, T Jump or modern day debates, like tens of thousands of people have seen us on internet platforms to some extent. Um, but that maybe we would be part of some conference where the bigger names in the field be like, oh yeah, I know Doooovid, he was at that conference, or he asked that question, or even that they would have heard my presentation, that somehow, like 2-3 years from now, I would be one of the presenters at the Science of Consciousness conference or something like that. um, but yeah, I mean, if you keep at it, that's the nature of expertise, that you'll become familiar with the other experts in the field, and then if you become an expert in the field, the other experts in the field will become familiar with you, and you'll probably communicate with them, share ideas, and so that's just the natural progression of gaining expertise and then producing expertise and advancing the field.
I look forward to it.
Okay, so I'll sign off, and if you want, you keep on rambling. Have a great week.
You too. I'll talk to you next Sunday, if not sooner. Looking forward to the next one and seeing what you write. I'm amazed that Doovid's been able to write so much. Frankly, I suck at writing. Absolutely suck at it. Takes me extremely long amounts of time to basically say nothing and remove the majority of what I put, because it's just so cringe that it's like, ugh, nah. So I won't go into a big ramble about it, but I'm just so happy about this Shankaracharya link. That's pretty much all I can think about right now. But I do have several articles on the blog about cognitive dissonance. I have a full model. It's very similar. It's very similar, but you're looking at it's a little bit more developed, where you're expecting something. There's a two-step process. Cognitive dissonance is the first step, and shock is the second. So there is a distinction. Most wouldn't perceive such a distinction, but because it's possible, you have to sort of note it, and you have to use different language. But I mean, obviously, something that's happening imperceptibly quickly can argue it's just all, one thing happening at once. Potentially. Obviously, that's going to run into problems, but effectively, it's when we're talking about applied things, it's not, I mean, even when we're talking about pure physics, it's not necessarily about accuracy because we have to talk about what does it mean to be accurate? I have to sort of answer that first. Like, what's the acceptance criteria? Well, it's does the thing work? And I don't know that it would work for everybody, but maybe for some who have a tendency to overthink things, having something to think about that allows for an alignment to a better state of consciousness, which I think there's a pretty clear path as to how this cognitive dissonance doctrine takes you there. You have an expected value, which is maybe or maybe not received as yes or no. And in this case, that trigger mechanism is sort of analogous to a thermostat, but it's not as boring as a thermostat only turning on when it triggers at a certain low amount. It's something that could change the amount of input of quote heat in this not very good metaphor at any time based on sensory input. So you have a two-step process basically happening imperceptibly fast where there's a perception, a dissonant perception, and followed by a reaction to that dissonant perception, which I'm calling shock. So I've got the cognitive dissonance, and then it's not always going to lead to a shock, which is where you get around this issue that can easily arise if you're just going to say, well, this material thing, this phenomenological thing is the cause of cognitive dissonance. Well, everybody's kind of different. Obviously, there's some things like being charged by a lion would probably be scary for most people, but it's not just fear that is going to induce the paralytic terror of cognitive dissonance necessarily. So anyway, it's all leading to the conclusion that one can avoid or minimize cognitive dissonance, which through experience is sort of concluded to be unwanted, or at least to be at the mercy of it is unwanted in some ways. And so decoupling the gripping tendency through practice of the objects of the expectation of a simulator, aka on the cognitive level, not really, that's more the like purely rational level. The cognitive level is just I have expectations, I don't necessarily know what they are. And the way to infer what they are is through recognition of cognitive dissonance. And the way to stop being at the mercy of cognitive dissonance is to experience it enough times that one can learn not to react to it. So I'm not saying charge into situations you know are going to upset you. I'm saying you're going to get upset even if you avoid all manner of risk in your own perception, because ultimately what's upsetting is a rigid set of expectations projected by the simulation of consciousness that is disappointed or set to false, or however you want to metaphorize or analogize that, and the corresponding reaction, which is probably a lot of what these correlates are pointing to, is expansion or contraction type behavior on the level of the mind, which is then, well, the mind is projected by the brain. So a change in the brain, aka what we can measure, would correspond to some type of change in the mind. But with the way causality works, it's really hard to know what's beginning, what's the end, and no necessary end to that. It doesn't have to be. The key thing is that if you don't have false beliefs, you're not going to get cognitive dissonance. So then the question is, well, how can I make it so that my beliefs aren't false? And then there's a personal inquiry into what it means to have non-false beliefs and how that doesn't necessarily line up with true. And then there's a further inquiry as to what constitutes truth and realization that truths are made true by the potential to be false in some sense, very broadly speaking. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and I look forward to what we're going to do in the future with all this fun consciousness stuff, and I'll be with be with everyone every step of the way, hopefully towards a greater understanding of all